Hey everyone! Welcome back to Muse Fanfiction. Get ready for an amazing tale. What if Naruto was reborn in the Potterverse and used shadow clones to claim Daphne Fleur and Hermione as his queens? Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The boy who remembered the first thing Natsuki Uzumaki-Black did when he was old enough to hold a crayon was draw a spiral. He didn't know why, not at first. He was 3 years old, sitting on the worn kitchen floor of Marin Pruitt's cottage in the Welsh countryside, and his tiny hand moved across the paper with a certainty that had nothing to do with being 3. The spiral came out clean, deliberate, the lines even. Marin, who was 64 and had spent most of her life pretending the magical world didn't exist despite every odd thing her late mother had told her about it, looked at the drawing and felt a chill she couldn't explain. She made him lunch and didn't mention it. By 5, the memories were coming in full. Not fragmented, not dreamlike the way most people describe past life recollections in the ghost stories and mystical traditions Marin occasionally read about in her armchair. Full. Complete. Vivid as anything he'd ever touched in this life. He would be sitting in the garden watching butterflies when suddenly he'd be standing on the red bridge in Konoha, leaning on the railing beside Sasuke while Sakura complained about something, the smell of ramen carried on the afternoon wind, and the feeling, the ache, of how much he had loved all of it so ferociously that it had powered him through things that should have been impossible. He cried about it once. Just once. He was 6. He sat in the back garden behind the old apple tree where Marin couldn't see him from the kitchen window, and he cried for everyone he'd lost, Jiraiya, Niji, Itachi, his mother and father whose faces he'd only found out late, Kurama, who had been as much a part of him as breathing, and when he was done, he wiped his face, looked up at the Welsh sky, which was grey and completely indifferent, and decided something. He was here. He was here. And if there was one thing Uzumaki Naruto had been put on the earth to do in any life, in any world, it was to live the hell out of it. He never cried about it again. He started training at 7. Marin thought he was just playing in the garden, doing those strange stretching exercises and handstand balances that seemed wildly advanced for a small child. She didn't ask questions. She was, in many ways, the perfect caretaker for someone like him, warm but not intrusive, curious but not nosy, and fundamentally unconcerned with things she couldn't categorize. She fed him well, made sure he slept, and let him be strange in peace. He couldn't generate chakra the way he used to. That much became clear quickly. The pathways weren't the same in this body, and whatever cosmic machinery had shuffled him from one world to another had reconfigured him at a fundamental level. But he wasn't gone. The knowledge was still there, every hand seal, every principle of chakra manipulation and nature transformation, and underneath it all, the muscle memory of a lifetime of training so relentless it had reshaped him from a talentless academy failure into the strongest shinobi his world had ever produced. So he rebuilt. Slowly. Patiently. With a patience, incidentally, that the original Naruto would have found absolutely agonizing and that Nate found almost meditative. He worked on his body first, flexibility, strength, speed, the kind of physical conditioning that didn't require chakra and that no one in this world would have context to understand. By 9 he could run 15 miles without stopping. By 10 he could hold a handstand for 2 hours. He moved like water and hit like a landslide, and none of the children at the village primary school wanted to spar with him twice. The magic arrived properly when he was 8. It had flickered before, the strange moments where something happened that Marin diplomatically pretended not to notice, but at 8 it came in clean and clear, and it felt, to Nate's profound surprise, similar to chakra in ways that made the back of his neck prickle with interest. Not the same. But related. Like two dialects of the same language, one of which he already spoke fluently. He began experimenting immediately. He didn't have a wand yet, but wandless magic, he discovered, was entirely possible if you had the kind of precise internal control that came from 10,000 hours of chakra manipulation drills. It was harder. Much harder. But Nate had learned to do things that were harder than hard, and he treated this the way he treated learning the Rasengan, with obsessive, systematic, joyful dedication until his mind and body understood it completely. By the time the letter arrived, he had done things with raw magical intent that he was reasonably sure no 11-year-old in the magical world had ever done. Not because he was showing off. Simply because, when you give someone with 20 years of shinobi memory and an Uzumaki's bottomless energy a new power system to play with, the results tend to be extraordinary. The letter came on a Tuesday in July. Marin brought it in from the post box with a complicated expression that was 3 parts nervousness and 1 part relief, held it out to him across the breakfast table, and said, "I was wondering when this would arrive." Nate looked at the emerald green ink, the wax seal, the parchment that felt slightly warm in his hands, and felt something shift in his chest. Not fear. Anticipation. "You knew?" he said. "Your mother was a witch," Marin said, sitting down heavily in her chair and wrapping both hands around her tea mug. "Or so my mother told me. I never met her. Your father I know even less about. But I always thought, I always felt," she stopped, looked at him steadily. "You're not a normal child, Natsuki." "No," he agreed easily, already opening the letter. "I'm really not." She smiled at that, just a little, like she'd been waiting for him to confirm it. He read the letter twice, then set it down and looked out the window at the apple tree. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He'd known it was coming. The British magical world had a different structure than anything from his previous life, and he'd spent considerable time in Marin's small but eclectic collection of books piecing together what he could about how it worked. He knew about the houses, the curriculum, Quidditch, the political climate, the recent history. He knew about Voldemort, the war that had ended 10 years before his current birth, the boy named Harry Potter who had somehow ended it. He knew about Dumbledore. That one required some thought. He tapped his fingers on the table once, then picked up a piece of toast and ate it thoughtfully. Dumbledore was, by all accounts, the most powerful wizard alive. He was also, by Nate's reading of the situation, a man who moved people around a board like chess pieces and called it protection. He'd done it to Harry Potter. He'd probably do it to anyone he identified as a significant variable in his designs. Nate had spent one lifetime being other people's secret weapon without his knowledge. He was not doing it again. "I'll need supplies," he said. "I've been putting a bit aside," Marin said. He looked at her, really looked at her, this small, quiet woman who had raised a child who was in every meaningful sense an alien to her world, who had never asked for explanation, never pushed, never tried to make him be something manageable. He felt something warm and very genuine move through him. "Thank you," he said. "For all of it." She waved her hand dismissively and poured more tea. Diagon Alley was, genuinely, the most interesting place he'd been in this life. Not because of the magic, he'd been doing magic for 3 years on his own, but because of the density of it. The sheer press of a living, breathing magical society that had developed its own traditions, its own economy, its own social hierarchies and fashions and absurdities entirely separate from the mundane world wrapped around it. He walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his eyes taking everything in, making connections, filing things away. The wand maker. The apothecary. The robes. The books, which he bought more of than the school list required because he was constitutionally incapable of passing a bookshop. He got his wand from Ollivander. Elder and dragon heartstring, 12 inches, unyielding. The old man had looked at him with those pale, unnerving eyes and said, "Curious. Very curious," and Nate had said, "Is it?" with such complete unimpressed calm that Ollivander had actually blinked and then laughed, a short, genuine, surprised sound, before wrapping the wand. "You've used magic before," the old man said. "Not a question." "A bit," Nate said. "Without a wand. Does that happen often?" Ollivander studied him. "More than the ministry would prefer." Nate smiled. "Good." He stopped in at Gringotts. The Pruitt connection to the Black family was distant enough that he hadn't expected anything, but the goblins, after a blood verification that they ran with impressive impersonality, informed him that there was a secondary account associated with the Uzumaki designation, which made absolutely no sense until he thought about it for a long time on the way home and decided that whatever machinery had moved him between worlds had apparently decided to be thorough about it. The account wasn't enormous, but it was enough. More than enough. He tipped the goblin handling his account. The goblin looked at the extra coins with an expression that was not quite shock but was clearly in the neighborhood. Nobody tipped goblins. For the efficiency, Nate said simply. September 1st arrived with all the chaos of a major railway station possessed by magic. Platform 9 3/4 was exactly as described, slightly mad, crowded with families, the scarlet train enormous and cheerful-looking, steam curling in great white billows across the platform. Nate moved through the crowd easily. He'd learned a long time ago how to slip through tight spaces without effort. He found a compartment near the back of the train and settled in with 3 books, one standard text, one he'd picked up in flourish and blots on the history of wandless magical theory, and one old volume on advanced transfiguration that was not on any first-year reading list. He opened the transfiguration book and began reading. He was 3 chapters in when the door opened and a girl with a wild cloud of brown hair and a prefect's badge that was comically premature for a first-year looked in with the practiced efficiency of someone cataloging available seating. "Do you mind? Everywhere else is full." "Sit," he said, without looking up from his book. She sat. There was a brief silence during which he was aware of her looking at his book with the particular attention of someone who recognized something they hadn't expected. "That's a 5th-year text," she said. "I know. You're reading it comfortably." "I'm reading it pleasurably," he corrected, turning a page. "There's a distinction." Another silence, different in texture. He looked up. She was watching him with the expression of someone recalibrating. Brown eyes, very sharp, currently narrowed slightly. Clever girl. He could tell within 40 seconds. "Hermione Granger," she said, with the slight emphasis of someone introducing themselves as a credential. "Nate Uzumaki-Black," he said. Though most people have historically stuck with Nate. "Uzumaki-Black," she repeated. "Is that, Welsh side and black family connection," he said. "Distant. Don't worry about it." "I wasn't worried, I was curious." "Better," he said, and went back to his book. She lasted about 90 seconds before she was pulling out her own texts, and somewhere in the process of both of them reading in the same compartment, the silence became comfortable. 2 more students joined them further along, a round-faced boy named Neville who was looking for a toad, and then a boy with a lightning bolt scar and startlingly green eyes who introduced himself quietly as Harry Potter with the slight bracing posture of someone used to that name causing a reaction. Nate looked at him, noted the scar, noted the wariness in those green eyes, noted the way the boy was already watching for everyone's response before they gave it. "Hi," Nate said. Harry blinked. Then, because Nate had moved straight back to his book with complete indifference, the boy's shoulders dropped about an inch and he settled into the seat across from him with something approaching relief. "Hi," Harry said. Nate liked him immediately. The Great Hall was genuinely impressive. He would give it that. He walked in with the other first-years and looked up at the ceiling, enchanted to show the night sky above, deep black and scattered with stars, and felt a flicker of something purely aesthetic. Beautiful bit of transfiguration work. Whoever had built this system and maintained it for centuries knew what they were doing. He looked around the hall. For tables, for houses, the older students already eating and watching the first-years file in with varying degrees of interest, condescension, and nostalgic amusement. He scanned faces without obviously scanning faces, an old habit, threat assessment, a thing you never entirely turned off once you'd spent years in active combat. At the Slytherin table, one face looked back at him. Gray eyes. Dark hair pinned back perfectly. A face that was composed with the specific, deliberate blankness of someone who had learned to use neutrality as armor. She was watching the first-years with the same systematic assessment he was doing, and he could tell the moment she realized he was doing it too, because her gaze sharpened by a degree and then, with what he suspected was considerable practice, went neutral again. He filed it away. Moved on. The sorting hat was, when it was placed on his head, startling. Not the fact that it spoke, he'd been prepared for that, but the intimacy of it, the sudden sense of something genuinely intelligent pressing gently against the edges of his mind. Interesting, it said. Very interesting. I've been called that before, Nate thought back. 2 lifetimes. I've seen a great many things in 1,000 years, but I've never seen quite this. A pause. You have the cunning for Slytherin, the loyalty for Hufflepuff, the courage for Gryffindor, and the intelligence for Ravenclaw. You are, in the most literal sense, impossible to categorize. So where do I go? Nate asked. Where do you want to go? He thought about it honestly, which he suspected was what the hat actually wanted. Not the strategic answer. The true one. He thought about what mattered to him, had always mattered to him in both lives: connection, growth, the specific pleasure of doing something hard until you did it right, the way a good team moved together, the deep satisfaction of making a place better than you found it. Gryffindor, the hat said, with something that sounded almost like amusement. Not because you're the bravest, though you are. But because you are, at the core of it, a protector. And protectors need to be where the danger is. Gryffindor, the hat announced. The table roared. He walked over calmly, sat down, and accepted the enthusiastic handshakes of people he didn't know yet with the patient good humor of someone who had once been carried through a village on people's shoulders. This was tame by comparison. He glanced across the hall at the Slytherin table. The gray-eyed girl wasn't looking at him anymore. She was talking to a blonde girl beside her. But she'd been looking a second ago. His first week at Hogwarts was productive in the way that the first week of any new environment is productive: information gathering, baseline assessment, identifying where the interesting things were and where the mines were buried. He attended every class with genuine focus. He'd spent years building knowledge from fragments, and now here were actual teachers with actual magical expertise, and he was not going to waste it. He listened. He took precise notes. He asked questions that made several professors stop mid-sentence and reconsider their prepared material. Professor McGonagall, after his third question in Transfiguration, a question that technically belonged in a fourth-year lesson, gave him a look that was equal parts pleasantly surprised and slightly unsettled. "Mr. Uzumaki-Black," she said. "How precisely did you come to know about nested transfiguration matrices?" "Reading," he said. Which was true. "What reading?" He gave her the title of the advanced text. She looked at him steadily for a long moment. Then she said, "Come see me after class," in the tone of someone who had just decided they needed to rethink their lesson plans. He did. She gave him a separate reading list with the manner of someone doing something slightly unprecedented while maintaining complete professional composure. He thanked her, and she looked at him with those sharp eyes and said, "Don't be insufferable about this." "I'll try," he said honestly. She almost smiled. Defense against the dark arts was taught that year by Quirrell, and Nate had done enough reading to have a very strong suspicion about Quirrell before the term was 2 weeks old. It wasn't the stutter, it was the eyes. The stutter was performance. The eyes were calculation. And there was a smell, faint but present if you trained yourself to notice these things, of something that didn't belong in one body. He said nothing. He watched. He took data as seriously as any other subject and refused to show what he actually knew, which was more than any professor in that room was ever going to teach him. He sparred with the theoretical material, asked questions that were just advanced enough to be interesting but not so advanced that they revealed the full shape of his knowledge. He was, in this respect, deliberately understated. Not because he was hiding. Because there was no point in showing your full hand to someone who was going to use that information against you. Quirrell, for his part, looked at Nate exactly twice during the first 2 weeks with an attention that wasn't professorial, and both times Nate smiled pleasantly back and watched the man decide to look elsewhere. The thing that set the first month truly in motion was the broomstick incident. Third week of October. Flying lesson on the grounds, Madam Hooch instructing a mixed first-year group on basic broom control. It should have been straightforward. It was straightforward, right up until Draco Malfoy snatched Neville's Remembrall and shot up into the air on his broom, grinning with the particular nastiness of a boy who had never been told no by anyone with authority over him. Harry went up after it. Of course he did. Nate watched from the ground with his arms crossed and thought, yeah, of course he did. What happened next happened quickly. Draco threw the Remembrall. Harry caught it, impressive reflexes, genuinely, in a dive that had Madam Hooch making a strangled sound beside Nate. And then everyone was talking at once, and McGonagall was striding across the grounds with the speed of a woman who had been teaching children for 40 years and could identify a crisis at 200 meters. She pulled Harry aside. There was a brief conversation. Harry looked bewildered. McGonagall looked like she was trying very hard not to smile. Draco Malfoy landed his broom nearby and adjusted his robes with the self-satisfaction of someone who thought he'd gotten away with something. He caught Nate's eyes as he landed and his expression shifted slightly, a flicker of assessment, the instinct of someone raised in a house that evaluated everyone immediately for usefulness or threat. Uzumaki-Black, Draco said. The Black connection, apparently, was worth acknowledging. Your friend nearly killed himself. Harry's fine, Nate said. He's a lucky idiot. He's a natural flyer who reacted correctly under pressure. Nate uncrossed his arms. Those are two different things. Draco's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being corrected by people he'd already filed under manageable. You think you know better than me about Quidditch? Honestly yes, Nate said pleasantly. About most things? Probably yes. I say that without any particular hostility, you're a smart person who was handed every answer before you could learn the questions. It's not your fault. It's just where you are. The silence that followed was the silence of someone who had never been spoken to quite that way, not cruelly, not dismissively, but with the particular patience of someone who had genuinely thought about it and reached a conclusion. Draco looked like he'd bitten into something that tasted entirely different than he expected. He left without responding. Which was probably the smartest thing he did that month. Pansy Parkinson, who had been standing 2 steps behind him, looked at Nate with an expression that he couldn't quite categorize, and then she left too. Hermione appeared at his elbow. That was remarkably direct, she said. Was I wrong about any of it? She thought about it. No, she admitted, in the tone of someone not entirely pleased about being right about something. Then it was just direct. He used his first shadow clone in early November, alone in an unused classroom at 11 at night. He'd been building toward it for weeks, the chakra was there, thin compared to what it had been in his past life but present, and he'd been painstakingly reconstructing the pathway using a combination of the body's natural magical circuits and the chakra control work he'd been doing for years. It was, in principle, not so different from very advanced wandless magical projection. The energy was similar enough that the pathways could overlap. He formed the hand seal in the dark classroom, pushed intent and energy outward, and felt the familiar pop of displacement as a perfect copy of himself materialized 3 feet away. He looked at the clone. The clone looked at him. Hey, Nate said. Hey, the clone said. It looked around the empty classroom with the orientation of something that had just been created and was assessing its context. This is different. Smaller scale. I'm working with about 15% of what I used to have. Enough for the basics. More than enough. He paused. I want you to read. He handed the clone the Wandless Magic Theory book. Go through chapters 7 through 14. Especially the section on intent-based casting circles. The clone took the book with the easy familiarity of something that had his hands and his memories. And when you dispel me, I'll get everything you learn. Same as always. The clone sat down cross-legged on the stone floor and opened the book. Nate sat across from him and opened his transfiguration notes. They worked in silence for 2 hours, and when Nate finally dispelled the clone, he felt the rush of 2 hours reading pour into his mind like water into a cup, organized, clear, complete. He sat for a moment letting it settle, then smiled. Two of me, he thought. And I've only just started. November deepened. The castle's social dynamics clarified themselves. He understood Harry better, a genuinely good person operating under the impossible weight of a reputation he hadn't asked for, surrounded by people who either wanted to own him or resented him. He understood Ron Weasley, who was loyal and funny and perpetually in the shadow of everyone around him without fully realizing it. He liked them both. Hermione was becoming something more interesting than a study partner. She was precise and thorough and occasionally wrong in the specific way that very clever people are wrong. She would read the map perfectly and miss the territory entirely. He challenged her on it regularly, and she challenged him back with a sharpness that he genuinely respected, and somewhere in the productive friction of that relationship, something that was going to matter a great deal had begun to grow without either of them noticing. He'd begun noticing the gray-eyed Slytherin girl more systematically by December. Not because he was pursuing it, he wasn't, not yet, but because she was genuinely interesting to watch. She moved through the school with a self-containment that he recognized, not coldness, but caution. A person who had learned that showing your feelings was a liability. She was, by most accounts, the sharpest mind in Slytherin's first year, and she carried it the way all people carry things they've been taught are dangerous, quietly, and with both hands. Her name was Daphne Greengrass. He'd known that from the start. What he hadn't known, from any amount of reading or social observation, was whether the sharpness in her eyes was because she was calculating or because she was searching. He filed that question for later. There was time. The troll incident on Halloween happened the way these things happened in a life that had been remade, without warning, in the middle of the noise and celebration of a feast, the doors of the great hall banging open to admit a panicked Professor Quirrell with his turban askew. Mountain Troll. In the dungeon. He'd watched people panic in two different worlds and both times the shape of it was the same, the dangerous people stayed calm while everyone else lost their minds. He was on his feet before the stampede started, moving against the flow toward the door, because Hermione was not in the hall and he'd registered that absence 40 minutes ago. He found Harry and Ron going the same direction. Of course he did. You know where she is, Harry said, jogging beside him. Girls' bathroom, second floor, crying, Nate said. She doesn't know about the troll. How do you know she's crying? Ron asked, then immediately answered his own question by going red. The Malfoy thing. I said it was fine, I thought she heard you say it wasn't, Nate said, which shut Ron up effectively. Come on. The troll was in the bathroom. It was large, it was stupid, it was exactly as dangerous as something 12 feet tall and covered in muscle with a large wooden club tends to be. It had the bathroom in pieces and Hermione was pressed against the wall between a shattered sink and a stall door, her face white and her eyes completely different from her usual confident expression. This was pure animal fear, and Nate felt something firm settle in his chest. Harry levitated the club. Ron was panicking but doing it usefully, which was more than could be said for most people. Nate vaulted onto the troll's back with the ease of someone who had once fought creatures that could level mountains, grabbed both of its ears, and drove his knee into the back of its skull with focused, precise force. The troll went down like a building collapsing. Harry and Ron stared at him. You jumped on its back, Harry said. It worked, Nate said, landing and dusting off his robes. You jumped on its back. We can discuss it later. Is everyone? He looked at Hermione, who had slid down the wall and was sitting on the wet stone floor, still white. Hermione. She looked up at him. She was shaking slightly. You're okay, he said, and meant it, not as comfort, but as fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who had assessed the situation and confirmed it. You're completely okay. It's over. She held his gaze for a moment that was longer than the moment it appeared to be on the surface. Then she straightened her back and pressed her lips together and said, in a voice that only wavered at the very edges, that was an incredibly reckless thing to do. Probably, he agreed. You could have been killed. I wasn't. She stared at him. Then she said, very quietly, thank you. McGonagall arrived with Snape and Quirrell. There was an interrogation and a response, and the whole thing resolved into house points and an unspoken understanding between 4 students who had been through something together, which is a specific and durable kind of bond. As they walked back to Gryffindor Tower, Hermione fell into step beside him, and he noticed that she had stopped shaking. He noticed something else. From across the corridor at the entrance to the dungeons, he could see the tail end of the Slytherin group being herded back to their common room, and at the back of the group, Daphne Greengrass turned and looked back. Not at the general scene. At him specifically. Then the group moved on and she was gone. He looked forward again and kept walking. December brought cold and exams and the heavy, specific quiet of a castle where half the students had gone home for the holidays. He stayed. Marin was perfectly happy to have him home for the summer. The holidays at Hogwarts were, he'd decided, too useful to waste on travel. He used the relative quiet of the near-empty castle with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been given a gift and fully intended to use it. During the days, he worked through every library book on the reading list McGonagall had given him, plus several she hadn't. In the evenings, he ran the castle's interior in a route he'd mapped during the first month, every hidden corridor, every shortcut, every room that wasn't on the official map. He found the Mirror of Eriste on the 14th night, in a classroom that had clearly been recently inhabited. He stood in front of it. Looked at what he saw. He'd been braced for Konoha. For the faces of people he'd lost. For a vision of his old self surrounded by old friends, the past made beautiful by impossibility. That wasn't what he saw. He saw himself standing in a place he didn't recognize yet, a hall, maybe, or a study, something with walls full of books, and on either side of him were people. A girl with dark hair and gray eyes, her face open in a way he'd never seen in real life. A girl whose silver blonde hair caught impossible light, laughing with a freedom that seemed to surprise even her. And a girl with wild brown curls, looking at something just out of frame with that specific bright sharp expression she got when she figured something out. He looked at the image for a long time. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, okay. Fair enough. He walked away and didn't come back. He found Harry there later. Harry told him about it eventually, what he'd seen, his family, his parents, and Nate listened with complete attention and said nothing trite. He just sat with it. Harry seemed to find that sufficient, which it was. Christmas was quiet. He sparred with his clones in the empty classroom every evening, pushing the technique further, learning how many he could sustain simultaneously in this new body with its recalibrated energy levels. The answer, by New Year's, was 4. Not the hundreds he'd commanded in his past life. Not yet. But 4 copies of himself, each capable of independent complex thought and action, each carrying his complete skill set and returning their experiences to him on dispersal. For Nates, each spending 2 hours a night on different disciplines, meant that his effective study time was 5 times what it appeared to be from the outside. He was perfectly content with that, for now. The school year finished the way first years finish, in a rush of exams and end-of-year chaos and the final dramatic unmasking of Quirrell that Nate had been expecting since October. He was not present for the confrontation in the underground chamber. Harry handled that, the way Harry was always going to handle it, because some things are written not by fate exactly but by character. But he was the person who found Harry later in the hospital wing and sat beside him while he was still pale and shaky, and said nothing in particular, which was the correct thing to say. How did you know where I was? Harry asked, looking at the ceiling. I always know where everyone is, Nate said. It's a thing I do. Harry turned his head and looked at him. What are you, really? Nate considered the question. Someone who's been around long enough to know what matters, he said. Harry seemed to find that more comprehensible than it probably should have been. On the train home, with Hogwarts shrinking behind them and the whole long summer ahead, Nate looked out the window at the English countryside passing in greens and greys and thought about the mirror. About what he'd seen in it. He wasn't in a hurry. He'd learned patience across a lifetime that most people never get. But he was interested, and that felt like something real and alive in his chest, which was as good a compass as any he'd ever found. He pulled out his advanced transfiguration text and opened it to where he'd left off. The future would come when it came. He'd be ready. Chapter 2, The Ice Queen's opening move. The summer was productive. Marin had learned, somewhere over the past year, to simply leave extra food on the kitchen counter and not ask questions about why Nate was up before dawn every morning doing things in the garden that she didn't have the vocabulary to describe. She was a practical woman. He was a practical boy. They got on. He ran. He trained. He sparred with clones in the early morning mist while sheep watched from the neighboring field with the profound indifference that sheep apply to most things. He worked through the books he'd brought home, not just the magical theory texts, but everything he could get from the village library on subjects that the magical world seemed to regard as irrelevant: chemistry, physics, military history, anatomy. Knowledge was knowledge. Every world he'd ever existed in had confirmed that the person who understood the most about how things actually worked was the person who survived the things that should have been impossible. He wrote to Hermione twice during the summer. She wrote back both times within 48 hours, her letters dense and precise and occasionally veering into areas of genuine intellectual excitement that she seemed faintly embarrassed about in the moment and then unable to help returning to. He liked that about her. The way her enthusiasm outran her composure. He did not write to Harry, because Harry had the Dursleys, and Nate had done enough reading about that situation to understand that correspondence going in and out of that house drew attention Harry didn't need. He made a note of it for second year. Something would need to be done about the Dursleys eventually. Not urgently. But eventually. He wrote to no one else. He had no reason to yet. By August he was running 6 clones simultaneously for the first time. 6 versions of himself, each working independently, each feeding information back on dispersal. He'd gotten better at managing the cognitive load. The rush of returned memory that came when a clone dispersed had been disorienting at first, like suddenly remembering something you'd been trying to recall all day, multiplied by 6 and arriving all at once. He'd adapted. His mind had always been more flexible than people expected from someone who'd been described, in his first life, as the idiot who passed by effort alone. He hadn't been an idiot. He'd been undertaught and undersupported, operating on willpower where others had technique. Given the technique, the willpower became something else entirely. He went back to Hogwarts on September 1st with 12 additional books he'd purchased from a Muggle second-hand shop, 3 new magical texts he'd oled away from a specialist supplier in Edinburgh, and the quiet settled certainty of someone who had spent 3 months doing exactly what they needed to do. Second year started the way second years start, everything slightly more comfortable than first year and slightly more complicated, the castle familiar now, the rhythms known, the faces around him no longer strangers. He settled in. He adjusted his schedule. He pushed his clone work further and began applying it to magical study in ways that he was reasonably sure had never been attempted before, simply because no one else in the magical world had access to a technique that let them be in 6 places at once. He sat in transfiguration while a clone attended an extra session in the library. He practiced charms while another clone worked through advanced wandless casting drills in the room of requirement, which he'd found at the end of first year and been quietly using since. He slept his standard 6 hours while a clone read and a second practiced physical forms in the empty hours after midnight. The magic replenishment came back during sleep for the original. The clone's work cost the energy it cost, but his reserves were growing monthly, and the efficiency was extraordinary. McGonagall had noticed. She hadn't said anything specific yet, but he caught her watching him sometimes with that evaluating look she gave to things she hadn't fully categorized. He respected it. She was too good at her job to be fooled by surface performance, and too professional to make accusations she couldn't support. Snape had noticed too, and responded to it in the way Snape responded to most things that challenged his assumptions, with increased hostility, as though aggression was a testing mechanism that revealed character. Nate didn't mind. Snape's lessons were good, once you cleared away the theater of his teaching style. The man genuinely understood potions at a level that went well past what most people recognized, and Nate took everything useful from the lessons with complete equanimity while deflecting the targeted snark with the patient cheerfulness of someone who has been insulted by people considerably more frightening than a bitter academic. Mr. Uzumaki-Black, Snape said, in the first lesson of second year, with the tone of a man warming up. Perhaps you could enlighten us, since you so clearly believe standard coursework is beneath you, on the precise reason powdered bicorn horn is added at the early stage of a polyjuice potion rather than after the lacewing flies. The class went very quiet. Everyone knew about Snape's Gryffindor interrogation routine. Because the bicorn horn acts as a stabilizing substrate for the base, Nate said, without looking up from his preparation notes. If you add it after the lacewing, the proteins from the flies create a bonding reaction that the horn can't penetrate. You'd get a partial transformation at best. Probably painful. He looked up. Though I imagine the person asking the question already knows that. Snape looked at him for a long, measuring moment. 5 points from Gryffindor, he said finally, for the editorial. Fair, Nate said, and went back to his notes. Ron, across the table, was visibly trying not to choke. Hermione looked between Nate and Snape with an expression that was equal parts horrified and extremely interested. You cannot talk to him like that, she whispered. I was respectful, Nate said quietly. You implied he was being deliberately ignorant. I implied he already knew the answer. That's a compliment. She pressed her lips together very hard and stared at her notes. The Chamber of Secrets opened in October. He felt the shift in the castle's mood the way he'd always felt these things, not through any specific magical sense, but through the accumulated data of watching a closed system under stress. People moved differently. Conversations dropped when certain people walked in. The cat was found petrified near a message written in what was very clearly blood, which suggested either a theatrical genius or an actual crisis, and given his experience with both, he was not inclined to rule out either. Mrs. Norris. Then Colin Creevey. Then others. The heir of Slytherin. He'd read about this, or rather, he'd read about the historical chamber, though the specific sequence of events was something that the magical history books didn't cover in the way that living through it covered it. He worked through it systematically. He didn't immediately share his working with Harry, though Harry was clearly investigating on his own and with Ron, because he wanted to understand the mechanism before he started offering theories. He sent a clone to dig through the library's restricted section, a clone that had been made under the disillusionment charm and that, being a chakra construct, left no magical residue the wards were calibrated to detect. Clever wards, built for magical intruders. Not built for something that wasn't quite magic in the way this world understood magic. What he found in the restricted section confirmed his early suspicion. A basilisk. The chamber's creature was a basilisk, the methodology was consistent, the petrification rather than death suggesting indirect eye contact, the absence of any other evidence of a physical attacker pointing to something that moved through spaces no one else could access. The Parseltongue connection to Slytherin was documented history. He wrote it up in his own notes, cross-referenced it, sat with it for 48 hours to see if any piece of his reasoning had a gap. It didn't. He would have gone to a professor with it, except that the professors were operating on a ninth of the information he had and would spend 3 weeks confirming what he'd already confirmed in 3 days, during which time someone could get killed rather than petrified. He went to Harry instead. I need you to listen to me without interrupting, he said, dropping into the seat across from Harry at the library table where Harry was doing his homework with the focused desperation of someone 2 weeks behind. Hello to you too, Harry said. Hello. Listen. He laid out his reasoning, clean and organized, the way he'd been taught to brief a team before a mission. What he knew. What he'd confirmed. What he suspected. The basilisk, the chamber, the mechanism, the fact that someone in the school was controlling it. Harry and Ron stared at him when he finished. How do you know all this? Ron said. Library and logic, Nate said. The library part is available to anyone. The logic part you develop with practice. And the Parseltongue thing, Harry started. You have it, Nate said. I know. I've noticed. That's actually useful here. Harry looked uncomfortable. Nate held his gaze. I know it's been a problem socially, he said. I don't care. It's a skill. Right now it might be the skill that keeps someone from dying. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened slightly. Okay, he said. What's the plan? What happened next was not clean or simple or safe, because these things never were, but it unfolded with more structure than it might have without Nate's involvement. Harry found the entrance. Nate went with him and Ron. Ron's de-handled wand incident meant Nate ended up on the forward side of the rockfall with Harry, which was where he'd planned to be anyway. The chamber itself was genuinely impressive. Ancient, vast, the kind of craftsmanship that only existed when extremely powerful people had decades and obsession to dedicate to a single purpose. He moved through it with his senses expanded, cataloging distances and air currents and the sounds that weren't quite sounds, things below the human threshold of comfortable hearing that a body trained to its limits could catch if it was paying attention. Tom Riddle's diary shade was waiting with Ginny. He watched the interaction. Let it play. Riddle was operating on an assumption that Harry was alone or as good as. He hadn't accounted for Nate, which was a reasonable failure of intelligence given that Nate had spent the year being visible but not conspicuous. When Riddle turned his wand on Harry, Nate moved. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. He simply closed the distance at a speed that was not normal for a 12-year-old, planted 2 fingers on Riddle's wand hand at the joint between radius and ulna, and applied exactly the pressure needed to make the hand open. The wand dropped. Riddle, the shade of 16-year-old Tom Riddle, reconstructed from stolen life force and anchored by dark magic, turned to look at him with those flat, terrible eyes and the kind of cold intelligence that only existed in people who had removed everything inconvenient from themselves. Interesting, Riddle said. What exactly are you? Someone you should have accounted for, Nate said pleasantly. Riddle recovered quickly. He was, even as a shade, extraordinarily fast, and launched a wordless blast of force that Nate sidestepped more or less completely, taking only a glancing hit that shoved him sideways. He felt the cold of it, dark magic in a pure and undiluted form, and under his feet the stone floor cracked where the edge of the spell touched it. Not harmless. But not enough. What followed was brief and genuinely dangerous and ended when Harry, with the sort of Gryffindor and Fawkes's help and the specific kind of desperate courage that had defined him from birth, drove the basilisk Fong through the diary. Riddle came apart. Ginny was alive. Pale and barely conscious, but alive. Nate carried her to the entrance. She was 12 years old and she'd been used as a vessel by something ancient and malicious and she weighed almost nothing, and he carried her without ceremony and set her down carefully when they reached the others, and when she looked up at him with terrified eyes he said, "It's over. You're safe," with the quiet conviction of someone who had decided it was true and made it so. The aftermath was McGonagall white with relief and Dumbledore's piercing blue gaze moving over Harry and then over Nate with the particular attention that Nate had been waiting for. The headmaster had one of those minds that turned immediately to the questions beneath the questions. He would be asking himself right now how a 12-year-old boy had processed a Chamber of Secrets mystery in 3 days and navigated an encounter with Tom Riddle's shade without dying. Nate met the old man's eyes. Smiled pleasantly. Said nothing useful. Dumbledore smiled back, and the smile was warm and genuine and also the smile of a man filing something away for later. Remarkable year, the headmaster said, to no one in particular. Truly remarkable. Sir, Nate said, Ginny Weasley needs to see a healer before anything else. The diary's magic may have left traces. Dumbledore looked at him. Indeed, he said, after the smallest pause. Quite right. He swept away to organize exactly that. As he left, Nate noticed the headmaster glance back once. He'd been noticed. That was fine. Being noticed by careful people was not a problem when you had nothing to hide. It was only a problem when you had an agenda you needed to protect. He didn't have an agenda. He had a direction. There was a distinction. November. The castle cold now, the grounds grey-skied and frost-edged in the mornings. He was in the courtyard eating an apple and reading the advanced charms text he'd picked up over summer when the shadow fell across him and he looked up to find Daphne Greengrass standing 3 feet away. She was doing nothing threatening. She was simply standing there, in Slytherin robes, with her dark hair loose for once instead of pinned, and her grey eyes doing that systematic assessment thing he'd noticed in her from the start. It was the closest she'd been to him all year. She'd been moving closer incrementally since October, and he'd been tracking it with the patient interest of someone who lets the interesting thing come to them. Greengrass, he said, and went back to his book. Uzumaki-Black, she said. She sat down on the bench at the opposite end from him with the deliberate precision of someone claiming territory rather than requesting it. He read for another 30 seconds. Let the silence be what it was. You've been watching me since September. I watch everyone, she said, without any embarrassment. Not the way you watch me. A pause. You handle things differently than other Gryffindors. I handle things differently than most people, he said. Gryffindor is incidental. She tilted her head. You figured out the chamber before anyone else did. Before anyone else admitted they had, maybe. Did I admit that? She said, and there was the faintest sharpening in her voice. He looked up from his book properly. Looked at her. She held it without flinching. Most people didn't, he'd noticed, when he gave them his full attention. Something in the quality of it was disconcerting to people who weren't used to being genuinely looked at. Daphne held it. You figured it out too, he said. It wasn't a question. Her jaw tightened very slightly. The petrification pattern was consistent with indirect contact. And there was a smell in the corridors near the incidents. Old. Animal. Basilisk, he said. Basilisk, she agreed. What did you do with that information? Kept it, she said. Why? Because in Slytherin, information is currency, and you don't spend it until you know the exchange rate. She said it like a fact, not a justification. What did you do with it? Told Harry. Helped handle it. You jumped straight from I know to I'm acting on it. Someone was getting hurt, he said. Holding the information wasn't making anyone safer. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he was starting to map, the slight tension around her eyes that meant she was processing something that didn't fit her existing model of a situation. Most Gryffindors would have been louder about it. I'm not most Gryffindors. No, she said, with the tone of someone closing a bracket on a long calculation. You're not. She stood. He watched her adjust the cuff of her left sleeve in a gesture that he recognized as the kind of unconscious self-regulating movement people made when they'd said more than they intended. She glanced at his book. Charms Theory. 5th year level. It's interesting, he said. Most people find it tedious. Most people are reading it wrong. She almost smiled. Just at the corners. It was there and gone so fast he might have imagined it, except that he had very good eyes and he trusted what they saw. She walked away. He watched her go, then looked back at his book, and didn't bother hiding the fact that he was smiling to himself. She came back 3 days later. This time she brought a charms problem she'd been working on, a question about the interaction between layered protective enchantments and the natural decay rate of cast magic over time, which was a genuinely interesting problem that he'd been thinking about from a different angle for 2 weeks. She sat down, stated the problem, and looked at him with the expectation of someone presenting credentials. He took the problem seriously. He always took problems seriously. He talked through it with her for 40 minutes, challenging her assumptions twice, having his own challenged once. She caught an error in his reasoning on the decay rate formula that he acknowledged immediately, which made her pause for a beat as though she'd expected him to argue. You're not going to defend the mistake, she said. You were right, he said. Why would I defend a mistake when I can just correct it? She looked at him with an expression he was starting to think of as her recalibrating face. Most boys argue. Most boys have more pride than sense, he said easily. She was quiet for a moment. You're not intimidated by being wrong. I've been wrong a lot, he said. You get used to it and then you start using it. Using it how? Every time you're wrong you find the edge of where your knowledge ends. That's useful. You can't map a space if you already think you know where all the walls are. She looked at him steadily. He could see her turning that over, testing the weight of it. Then she gathered her notes with that practiced efficiency of hers and stood. Same time Thursday, she said, in a tone that was not quite casual. I'll be here, he said. She left. He watched the courtyard settle back into its ordinary mid-morning quiet and thought about the way she asked questions. Direct, but careful. Precise, but not cold, not really, not underneath. The coldness was the room, but she was the thing in the room, and they were not the same. They met Thursday. And the Thursday after that. The sessions had a structure that neither of them named, not quite study partnership, not quite friendship, something with edges that were still being defined. She challenged him intellectually on subjects where her knowledge exceeded his, which was in areas of pure magical theory where she'd clearly been doing advanced work since she was very young. He challenged her in areas of applied thinking and strategic reasoning and the occasional flat refusal to accept a premise without testing it. He introduced her to a way of thinking about problems that she didn't have a name for, breaking things down to first principles, removing assumptions, building back up from what you actually knew rather than what tradition said you should know. She took to it with the speed of someone who had been circling that approach for years without finding the door. He showed her the door. She showed him things about pure magical theory that recalibrated several assumptions he'd been operating on. The exchange was genuine and productive and privately exhilarating in the way that only happens when two people are well matched enough to actually push each other. Pansy Parkinson, who watched Daphne the way a person watches something they feel proprietary about, began giving Nate looks that he categorized as hostile curious, hostile because his presence in Daphne's routine was unprecedented, curious because she couldn't quite identify what he was. Draco Malfoy noticed too, with a different quality of attention, calculating, slightly offended, the attention of a boy who had decided Daphne Greengrass was in his sphere of influence and did not enjoy evidence to the contrary. Draco made his move in late November. Not confrontationally, that wasn't Draco's first approach when he wasn't in a group. He was smarter than his public persona suggested, and his first instinct was leverage. He approached Nate in the corridor outside Potions with the manner of someone making a reasonable offer. You should know, Draco said, falling into step beside him, that Greengrass has certain social obligations within Slytherin. Her family's alliances include, I know about pure-blood social structures, Draco, Nate said pleasantly, not slowing down. I've done the reading. Then you know that her associating with a Gryffindor publicly is, her choice, Nate said. Draco stopped. Nate kept walking, because stopping was optional and he didn't feel like it. You're not listening, Draco said, louder now. Nate turned around. He did it without hurry, without irritation. I listened to everything you said, he said. I'm disagreeing with the premise, not ignoring it. There's a difference. He tilted his head. You're not actually concerned about Daphne's social standing. You're concerned about the implication of her choosing to spend time with someone you haven't approved. Those are two different problems and only one of them is real. Draco's jaw tightened. He had the look of someone who had gone into a negotiation expecting a clear power differential and was discovering the ground was flat. She's not mine to approve or disapprove, he said stiffly, after a moment. Correct, Nate said. So we're done here. He went to Potions. Hermione, who had been 3 steps behind and had heard the entire exchange, caught up with him at the classroom door. He's not going to let that go, she said quietly. He'll process it and make a decision, Nate said. Either he'll try something more direct, which I can deal with, or he'll decide it's not worth his energy, which solves itself. And if he decides something in between? Something social? Something political? He looked at her. Then we deal with that too. He paused. You've been thinking about Slytherin politics. I've been thinking about all the ways something can go wrong, she said, with the expression she wore when she was 3 steps ahead of a problem and finding it more alarming than satisfying. Welcome to the party, he said. I've had a table reserved there for years. She stared at him. Then she said, despite herself, that was almost funny. Almost, he agreed. December. The Christmas incident was minor on the surface and significant underneath, the way the important things always were. He'd been working late in the room of requirement, for clones running simultaneously, himself doing wandless precision work that he'd been developing for 6 weeks, the room configured as a training space with targets and surfaces and one corner set up as a library. He was deep in a layered casting drill when the door opened, which it shouldn't have been able to do when occupied, and Daphne Greengrass walked in. She stopped. Looked at the clones. Looked at him. The clones stopped what they were doing. He felt 4 sets of eyes from 4 angles, all carrying his awareness, all looking at the same thing, Daphne, completely still in the doorway, her gray eyes moving from one version of him to the next with the precision of someone cataloging a completely unprecedented data set. He dispelled the clones. The rush of 4 returns hit him and he absorbed it without visible reaction. By now the cognitive load management was easy. He looked at her. Sit down, he said. Before you make the decision standing up. She came in. The door closed behind her. She sat on one of the room's created chairs with the deliberateness of someone putting herself in a position before she fully understood it. Her eyes were still moving, cataloging the space. Those were copies of you, she said. Yes. Fully functional. Thinking independently. Yes. That's not a known magical discipline. No, he said. It's not. She was quiet for a long moment. He let it be quiet. Outside the castle, December wind moved against the high windows, and in the room of requirement all the specific warmth of a created fire was doing nothing to make this moment less charged. How many things do you know that aren't known magical disciplines, she said finally. Several, he said. Why are you showing me this? You walked in, he said. I could have made it look like nothing. I didn't. She turned that over. You chose to let me see it. You were going to figure out eventually that something was different about me, he said. I've been watching you work for 2 months. You're too thorough to miss it forever. I'd rather you find out facing me than find out from a corner. She looked at him with that gray gaze that was never, he was increasingly sure, actually cold, it was clear. There was a distinction. Cold was closed. Clear was open in a specific, careful way, like a window you'd crack just slightly in a room that had been shut too long. You trust me with this, she said. I trust your intelligence, he said. And I trust that you understand the value of information enough to handle it carefully. That's not the same as trusting me. No, he said. But it's the beginning of it. She was quiet again. Then, with the controlled precision of someone making a formal declaration, I won't tell anyone. I know, he said. That's not why I showed you. She looked at him and for a moment something shifted in her face, not much, not dramatically, just the faintest easing of that careful neutrality, like a hand unclenching without the person noticing. Then why? She said. He thought about how to answer it truthfully, which was the only way he knew how to answer things. Because you've been sitting across from me for 2 months, he said, working on problems that genuinely interest you, treating me like someone worth arguing with, which is more honest than most people manage. And I think you've spent a long time in a house where being known means being vulnerable. I wanted you to know that it doesn't have to. The silence was different this time. Not empty. Full. She looked at him for what was probably 15 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then she stood, straightened her robes with that unconscious precise gesture, and looked at him from the doorway. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She left. He stayed in the room of requirement for a while after, in the quiet, with the room slowly reconfiguring itself around him because it was responding to what he needed, and what he needed was simply space to sit with the fact that something had shifted tonight. Not dramatically. Not irrevocably. But shifted. He thought about the mirror of Eriste, and about the girl with grey eyes whose face had been open in a way he'd never seen it in real life. He thought, patience. The end of year came with all the drama that end of years produced. Ginny recovered, the school deterrorized, the year's damage assessed and catalogued. He handed in every exam with the quiet confidence of someone who had studied the material from 3 different angles using 5 different minds and still found it interesting. McGonagall handed him his results personally and said, "Next year," with an emphasis that suggested she was already planning something. "I'll be ready," he said. "I know," she said, which was the most direct thing she'd ever said to him outside of subject matter, and which stayed with him on the train south. Hermione sat across from him. She was reading, but she was reading with the specific inattention of someone thinking about something else, and he could tell by the angle she was holding the book that she wasn't actually taking in the text. "Say the thing you're thinking," he said. She looked up. "I wasn't, Hermione." She closed the book. "I've been watching you all year," she said, in the tone of someone issuing a formal statement. "The way you work. The way you handle things. The chamber. Draco. Daphne." She paused. "I'm not asking questions I don't want the answers to. I just want to say that I see it. Whatever it is." She paused again. "You're not what you look like from the outside." "What do I look like from the outside?" he said. "Capable," she said. "Which is obvious. But from the outside it looks effortless, and I've been around long enough to know that things that look effortless are usually the result of more effort than anyone sees. She stopped. Started again. "I wanted you to know that I see the effort. Even if I don't see all of it." He looked at her. Her chin was up slightly, the way it went when she'd said something that had cost her something and she wasn't going to show that it had. "Thank you," he said. And meant it the way he meant things, completely. She nodded briskly. Opened her book again. But she was smiling at the page for a moment before her expression settled back, and he noticed, because he noticed things. The train moved south. The castle shrank behind them in the window. In his pocket, his wand sat warm and familiar. In his chest, the feeling he'd been sitting with since November was clearer now, not urgency, not exactly excitement. More like the feeling of standing at the beginning of a path you've mapped carefully, with good boots and a clear direction and all the time in the world. He settled back into his seat, picked up his book, and began planning 3rd year. Chapter 3, The Girl Made of Sunlight. 3rd year arrived with Dementors. He felt them before he saw them. The train had been moving for 3 hours through rain-heavy English countryside when the temperature dropped in a way that had nothing to do with weather, and the lights flickered, and in the sudden grey dark of the compartment Nate felt something reach toward him that was not cold exactly but was the shape of cold, the specific quality of the worst moments of both his lives, pulled up and arranged in front of him like an exhibit. Jiraiya dying. Niji's face in the mud. Kurama's voice going quiet at the end, that enormous warm presence contracting to nothing. His parents, whose faces he'd only known too late, presented to him as proof that love always cost something. He breathed. Let the memories be what they were, real, finished, survived. He was not in them. He was here, in this compartment, on this train. He opened his eyes. Around him, Harry had gone grey-white and slid sideways in his seat. Ron was pressed against the window with wide eyes. Hermione's hands had gone to her mouth. Across from him, Neville had curled in on himself, and the new professor, Lupin, traveling with them, who'd been asleep until 60 seconds ago, was on his feet with the particular controlled movement of a man who had been near Dementors before and had not enjoyed it. Nate put his hand on Harry's shoulder and kept it there with steady pressure, and Harry didn't fall off the seat. Lupin drove the Dementor back with a Patronus, a silver shape that charged down the corridor with the easy authority of something that knew exactly what it was doing. Nate watched the casting with professional interest. A corporeal Patronus. Full silver form. Lupin produced it without hesitation in a situation where most people would have needed a moment to compose themselves, which meant the man was operating out of old, deep habit. He filed it. There was more to Remus Lupin than the shabby robes and the tired eyes suggested. He fed Harry chocolate from Lupin's block and steadied him through the next 20 minutes while the compartment came back to itself, and the whole time he was thinking about the Patronus, the mechanism, the intent. He'd been doing wandless work for 2 years and the Patronus charm was theoretically in the range of what he could attempt, but the emotional component was interesting. The caster had to hold something specific in mind, happiness, they said, but not just happiness. Something realer than that. A memory that was true in the bones. He started working on it that night. The year organized itself. Daphne continued meeting him in the courtyard and now occasionally in the room of requirement, and their sessions had evolved from intellectual sparring into something that looked, from a distance, like friendship, and from closer up looked like two very self-contained people carefully dismantling each other's defenses in a way that both of them found simultaneously alarming and worth it. She'd seen his clones. She'd never mentioned it to anyone, he knew, because the only thing that would have happened faster than Dumbledore noticing something like that was someone mentioning it to Dumbledore, and the headmaster's behavior toward him had not materially changed. She kept the secret with the practiced discretion of someone who understood that the value of trust was in its maintenance. In return, she'd begun letting him see things she didn't show other people. Not dramatically, not confessions or emotional declarations, nothing so direct in someone so carefully constructed. But she would tell him about her family in the flat, factual way that people use when they're trying to make something emotional sound like information. Her mother's illness. Her father's political positioning in a world that was restabilizing after a war. Her sister Astoria, younger by 3 years, sweet in a way Daphne seemed to find both precious and frightening, because sweetness in their world was a vulnerability and Daphne was constitutionally unable to stop protecting the things she loved. He listened to all of it without trying to fix it, because it wasn't something that wanted fixing. It was something that wanted witnessing. "You don't give advice," she said to him once, in early October, when the leaves outside had gone gold and the courtyard had the particular clean cold smell of autumn properly arrived. "Not unless you ask for it," he said. "Most people who listen do it waiting for the moment they can start talking." "I know," he said. "It's annoying." She looked at him sideways. "You're not going to tell me what I should do about my father's plans. Do you want me to?" She was quiet. "No," she said finally. "Then I won't," he said. "But if you ever do, I'll ask," she said, in a tone that was not as clipped as she intended it to be. He smiled at the middle distance and let it alone. Hermione was having her worst year. He could see it. The time turner she was using was obvious to him once he started looking, which took about 2 weeks. She was attending classes that ran simultaneously, operating on compressed time, running herself ragged with the ferocious energy of someone who had decided that excellence was a quantity you could acquire by sheer accumulation if you just worked hard enough and long enough. She was wrong about that, and she knew she was wrong about it, and she was doing it anyway, which was the specific kind of stubbornness that came from being afraid of what would happen if you stopped proving yourself for 5 minutes. He didn't tell her she was doing too much. She would have deflected it. Instead he started showing up in her vicinity with food when she forgot to eat and problems worth thinking about when she had too much energy and nowhere to put it. He debated her. He challenged her. He occasionally sat beside her in comfortable silence and read while she worked, which was a different kind of company than she usually had, not the Hermione please help us company of Harry and Ron, not the condescending adult company of some of the professors, but actual peer company, 2 people in the same space doing their own things with equal seriousness. She started noticing things about him around November. He could tell because she began watching him with a slightly different quality of attention than before, not the cataloging of an interesting problem, but something more personal, more confused, the attention of someone who has realized they like something more than they expected and doesn't quite know what to do about that. He didn't push it. He wasn't going to. But he filed it with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered. Lupin proved to be an extraordinary teacher. Genuinely extraordinary, the best defense Professor Nate had encountered, which was a bar set low by Quirrell but raised considerably by someone who clearly understood the subject at a lived, embodied level. The Boggart lesson was the first indication, but it was the private conversations after class that really showed the man's quality. Lupin would stay after when students had questions, and his answers were never condescending and never oversimplified, and occasionally they were so precise and clear that they recalibrated something Nate had been thinking about from the wrong angle. He asked Lupin about the Patronus in November. Not casually, he went to Lupin's office after dinner with the specific intention of having the conversation, and he was direct about it because directness was more efficient and because Lupin, he'd decided, was a man who respected directness. "I want to learn the Patronus charm," he said. "I can handle the emotional component. I need to understand the structural mechanics of how the charm interfaces with Dementor magic." Lupin looked at him over his desk with those tired, careful eyes. "It's a third-year charm technically," he said. "Most wizards don't attempt it until considerably later." "I know," Nate said. "I'm not most wizards." Lupin studied him. Something in his expression shifted, not quite amusement, not quite recognition, something in between. "No," he said, after a moment. "I don't think you are." He leaned back in his chair. "Sit down. Let's talk about it properly." They talked for 2 hours. It was the kind of conversation Nate hadn't had with an adult in either of his lives, genuine, technical, mutual. Lupin knew things about the Patronus charm that weren't in any book, the kind of practical knowledge that comes from having needed it for real and having thought about it since. He was also, it became clear about 40 minutes in the process of quietly assessing whether Nate already knew things that third years shouldn't, and being consistently impressed by the answers he found. "Where do you get it from?" Lupin asked, in a pause between technical points, with the tone of someone who had decided to ask the real question. "Get what from?" Lupin moved his hand slightly, a gesture that encompassed all of it. "The way you think. Most students your age are trying to learn the map. You're talking about the territory." "I've been around," Nate said, which was the most honest answer available. Lupin looked at him for a long moment. "Have you spoken with the headmaster?" "Briefly," Nate said. "I imagine he has questions." "He does," Lupin said carefully. "He mentioned you, actually. After your first year." Nate raised an eyebrow. "He said," Lupin continued, with the measured delivery of someone choosing words with precision, "that you were the most interesting student to arrive at Hogwarts in 20 years and that he wasn't sure yet whether that was wonderful or complicated." Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Both, probably." Lupin laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and slightly surprised, and it made him look about 10 years younger. "Probably," he agreed. He cast his first Patronus on a Thursday night in early December, in the room of requirement. He'd been building toward it for weeks, doing the structural work, the internal preparatory exercises, the specific quality of emotional focus that the charm required. He understood the mechanism now, not just the theory but the felt sense of it, the way you had to hold something true and warm at the center of yourself and then project it outward with enough force to push back against something that fed on despair. He knew what memory to use. He'd known since Lupin described the requirement. He thought of the ramen shop in Konoha. Tucci and I.M., the ordinary smell of good food and steam, Irika-sensei sitting across from him in the booth after the graduation exam, the specific look on Irika's face when he said, "I want you to have my headband," not pity, not charity, but recognition. The first time another person had looked at him and seen someone worth acknowledging. He raised his wand, held the memory clean and bright at the center of himself, and cast. The Patronus came out silver and massive and took a form that made him stop and stare at it for 3 full seconds. A fox. Enormous, nine-tailed, its tails fanning out behind it in a corona of silver light that lit the room of requirement from wall to wall. It turned to look at him with silver eyes that held something that was not intelligence exactly but was the shape of intelligence, and then it opened its mouth and a sound came out that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a roar and was entirely characteristic of Kurama, and Nate felt something move through him that was very much like grief and very much like reunion and not at all like either of those things. "Hey," he said, to the silver fox. The Patronus held its form for 30 seconds. Then it dispersed, light contracting to a point and blinking out, and the room of requirement was ordinary dark again. He sat down on the floor where he was and stayed there for a while. The Triwizard Tournament announcement came at the start of term feast at the beginning of his 4th year, and the news hit the Great Hall like a stone dropped in still water, ripples in every direction, loud, immediate, thrilling. Dumbledore's amplified voice explaining the details. An age line at 17. 3 champions. 1 from each school. Bows batons and Durmstrang arriving at Hogwarts. He listened to all of it with his chin in one hand and his cup of pumpkin juice in the other, and thought, useful. Not for glory. He had no particular interest in glory, he'd had enough of it in one lifetime to know that it was mostly other people's feelings about you, which were interesting data but not something to organize your life around. What the Triwizard Tournament represented was a structured high-stakes environment with tasks designed to test magical ability at the outer edge of what was possible. 3 tasks, unknown in advance, requiring the full range of skills. The goblet would select the most capable candidate from each school. He was going to enter. Obviously. He was also, technically, too young. The age line was Dumbledore's work, and it was solid. He'd examined it twice before the feast was over, walking past the goblet's new placement in the entrance hall with his hands in his pockets and his senses extended. A classical age restriction weave, embedded at approximately 17 years of magical maturity rather than chronological age. It was good work. It was also not designed to account for someone whose magical core had been developing at an accelerated rate for 3 years through techniques borrowed from a completely different discipline. He thought about it for 24 hours. He talked to no one about it. He ran a clone through the theoretical bypass 3 times from different angles and confirmed his reasoning. Then he wrote his name on a piece of parchment, walked up to the Goblet of Fire at midnight when the entrance hall was empty, stepped over the age line with the specific quality of magical suppression he'd been developing since 2nd year, not quite cloaking, more like agreement, the kind of soft internal calibration that told the ward this person belongs here, and dropped his name in. The goblet flared blue. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower and went to sleep. Bows batons arrived in a carriage that descended from the sky. He was watching from the steps with the rest of the school when it came down, drawn by enormous winged horses that moved with the specific grace of creatures that had been bred for beauty and had the personality to match. The carriage landed. Students filed out. And then the girl at the front of the group walked into the October afternoon, and the entire assembled student body made a collective sound that was not quite a sound, more a shift in the quality of attention, the way a crowd responds to something it doesn't have language for yet. She was tall. Silver blonde hair that moved even in still air. A face that was, by any aesthetic standard, extraordinary. She moved like she owned the ground under her feet, which wasn't arrogance exactly, it was the specific confidence of someone who had spent their entire life being the most striking thing in any room and had learned to carry it without apology. Around him, boys in every direction had stopped functioning. Nate watched her with the detached interest of someone evaluating a new variable. Vila heritage, quarter, maybe, from the way the effect was present but not overwhelming to someone with reasonable self-regulation. The allure was real magic, not metaphor. He could feel it operating at the edges of his perceptions, a warm insistent pull that was clearly designed to circumvent higher reasoning. He noted it, noted the mechanism, noted the way it interacted with ambient magical fields, and set it aside with the ease of someone who had spent years doing chakra suppression exercises that made shutting down involuntary physical responses essentially automatic. She was also, he could tell from 30 feet, extremely good at reading a room. Her eyes moved over the assembled students with the practiced efficiency of someone who was constantly assessing how many people were looking at her and whether they were threats or not. She looked at him. He looked back. Something flickered across her expression, a slight shift, the barest micro-expression, there and gone. She looked away. He filed it. The goblet made its selections on Halloween night. Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts. Victor Crumb for Durmstrang. And the Beauxbatons champion, stepping forward with that specific quality of composed pride, Fleur Delacour. She walked to the front with her chin up and her face perfectly controlled, and something in the way she moved suggested that she'd expected this and had prepared herself for the weight of it, and was currently doing the thing that poised people do when they're actually feeling something significant, hold very still on the outside. And then Dumbledore held up a hand and said there was a fourth name, and the great hall went quiet in the specific way that precedes something unprecedented. Nate Uzumaki-Black. He was already standing up by the time the sound of his name finished. He heard the noise that went through the hall, confusion, shock, several voices saying he's only 14, and from the Slytherin table a composed silence that he caught at the corner of his vision. He walked to the front without hurrying. Dumbledore was looking at him with blue eyes that were warm and specific and absolutely not surprised. Curious, the headmaster said, quietly enough that only Nate could hear it. Very curious. I've been called that before, Nate said. Something moved in Dumbledore's expression. Not displeasure, something more complicated, the expression of a chess player who has identified a piece that isn't following the expected movement rules. The age line, Dumbledore said, was well constructed, Nate said sincerely. Genuinely impressive work. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, I imagine it was, and ushered him toward the champion's room. In the champion's room, Cedric was pleasant and slightly stunned. Victor Crumb was stone-faced and evaluating, the look of a competitor who was immediately taking stock. Fleur Delacour turned when Nate walked in and looked at him with an expression that moved through surprise, assessment, and landed on something that was unmistakably irritated. You are the fourth champion, she said. In English, lightly accented, with the precision of someone who learned languages the way she apparently learned most things, completely. Yes, he said. You are 14. Also yes. Her eyes narrowed. How did you get past the age line? Carefully, he said. Her jaw tightened. It was a beautiful jaw, all clean angles, and currently arranged in an expression of pure aristocratic displeasure that he found genuinely entertaining. This is not a joke, she said. The tasks are dangerous. The last tournament had deaths. I know, he said. I read the history. Reading history is not preparation, he said, pleasantly. I agree. That's why I didn't stop at reading. She stared at him. The Vila allure was, he noted, still completely failing to do anything useful in his direction, and he could tell she'd noticed that it was failing, and he could tell she was not sure what to do with that. People who didn't respond to her the way other people responded to her were apparently a category she hadn't fully built a framework for yet. You are very confident for someone very small, she said. You're very defensive for someone who's already won the thing she was competing for, he said, not unkindly. You got the spot. I'm not taking it from you. I'm just also here. She opened her mouth. Closed it. The displeasure in her expression was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, the specific micro-shift of someone receiving information that doesn't match their model and needing a second to update. Victor Crumb, from his position against the wall, made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh converted into a cough at the last second. They returned to the great hall for the official announcement and the weight of 1,000 stairs. He walked back to his seat while the hall buzzed and settled into his food with the equanimity of someone who has been stared at by entire villages and found it considerably less interesting than breakfast. Hermione was beside him before he'd gotten through his first bite. How? She whispered, with the specific urgency of someone who needed data immediately. Age line bypass, he said. That should be impossible. Most things that seem impossible are just misclassified, he said. Pass the bread. She passed the bread with an expression that cycled through incredulous, impressed, and deeply concerned, landing somewhere in the middle of all three. The tasks are going to be dangerous, she said. I know. You could get, Hermione, he said. You know who I am. You've been watching me for 3 years. Do you actually think I entered this without preparation? She looked at him. The concerned expression shifted, not gone, but reorganized. No, she said, after a moment. I don't think that at all. Good, he said. Then worry less and help me with the research side. 2 minds are better than 1. She pressed her lips together, looked briefly like she was going to argue, and then pulled out a quill. What do we know about the historical task formats? Not much specific, he said. Which means we start from scratch and build up. She was already writing. He looked across the hall. At the Slytherin table, Daphne was watching him with those gray eyes, her expression doing that clear but not cold thing. He held her gaze for a moment. She gave him the faintest nod, the kind that existed at the very limit of what could be called a nod, the kind that only happened when someone was being precise about showing support without advertising that they were showing support. He looked at the Beauxbatons table. Fleur Delacour was talking to one of her schoolmates, her head bent, silver hair curtaining her face. But he could tell from the set of her shoulders that she was still thinking about what had happened in the champion's room. Good, he thought. People who were still thinking about you were paying attention. And people who were paying attention were people you could actually reach. The weeks between the goblet announcement and the first task were, by any metric, interesting. The school sorted itself into camps, people who thought the 4th champion was an unprecedented achievement and followed Nate around with excessive admiration, people who thought he'd cheated the goblet and were aggressively public about that opinion, and the majority who were simply watching to see what happened, which was the camp he respected most. Draco Malfoy had produced Potter Stinks badges at the start of 4th year, shortly after Harry's name had also come out of the goblet, because of course it had, and Nate had been sitting next to Harry when it happened and had seen the boy's face go through a half-dozen expressions in 2 seconds, none of them good. Draco's support badge campaign had immediately required a modification when the 4th name was announced. He'd been seen, twice, trying to decide whether to produce a second set of badges and settling for glaring at Nate from across rooms instead, which Nate found entirely manageable. What was less manageable, in the sense of being a more interesting problem, was Fleur Delacour. She began appearing in his vicinity. Not following, she had too much pride for anything that looked like following. But she would be in the library at the same time he was there, working at a table 3 rows over, and she would be in the Great Hall when he was there, 2 tables away, and on the grounds when he was doing his morning run, walking back from the lake with her Beauxbatons schoolmates. Each time, if their eyes met, she looked away first. Each time, he noticed, she looked back within 30 seconds. He said nothing. He went about his preparation with the same systematic focus he'd been applying to everything for 3 years, now directed entirely at the problem of 3 tasks of unknown nature in an environment designed to push champions to their absolute limits. He ran his clones through every historical Triwizard record he could find. He drilled. He expanded his wandless work significantly, because the most reliable magic in a genuinely uncontrolled situation was magic that required no external tool. She intercepted him in the library on a Wednesday evening in November. She sat down across from him with the deliberate composure of someone who had been building up to something and had decided to simply do it. She folded her hands on the table. Her blue eyes were direct and considerably less hostile than the last time she'd spoken to him. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead," he said. "In the champion's room," she said. "When I first came in. You looked at me and then you just," she made a slight gesture. "You went back to whatever you were thinking about." "You didn't," she stopped. "React to your allure," he said. She held his gaze. "Most people cannot help it." "I know," he said. "I have good self-regulation." "It is not just self-regulation. I can feel when someone is suppressing the effect. You were not suppressing it. You simply, she stopped again, searching for the word. It was as though it passed through you and found nothing to catch on. He considered how honest to be. I've spent years doing internal exercises, he said. Controlling involuntary physical responses. The allure works on the same pathway as fear response and pain response. I've been managing those for a long time. She looked at him steadily. Something was moving behind those blue eyes, not the practiced social calculation he'd expected from her, but something more genuine, less armored. You are not afraid of it, she said. No, he said. And you're not pretending not to be affected because you want to seem impressive. I genuinely am not affected, he said. Which is different. She was quiet. He went back to his book and let the quiet be what it was, the way he always did. Around them the library moved in its quiet evening rhythms, pages, the scratch of quills, Madame Pance's distant surveillance. It is strange, Fleur said, to be seen without that in the way. He looked up. Is it good strange or bad strange? She seemed startled by the question. I don't, she paused. I am not certain yet. That's an honest answer, he said. I am usually honest, she said, with a slight edge, as though honesty was something she was mildly defensive about. I know, he said. I've been watching you for a month. You don't perform for people the way they expect you to. That's more honest than most people manage. She looked at him with an expression that he was beginning to map, less armored than Daphne's, more immediately visible, but equally real. Fleur's emotions were present, they were just moving fast. She felt things quickly and deeply and had learned to project a surface that ran ahead of them like a ship's bow cutting water. You have been watching me, she said. I watch everyone, he said. That is what the greengrass girl says about herself, Fleur said, with a tone he couldn't quite parse. Do you know her well? Well enough, he said. Something moved in Fleur's expression, not jealousy exactly, but its younger cousin, the awareness that a person you've been thinking about has people in their life you don't know. She is very serious, Fleur said. She is, he agreed. So are you, when you drop the armor. Fleur's chin went up. He held her gaze. Not challenging, clear. The same clarity he'd used with Daphne in the room of requirement on the night everything shifted. I see you. Not what you project. You. The chin came down by about half a degree. I don't know you, she said. Not yet, he said. She looked at him for a moment that had a specific quality, suspended, full of something that hadn't decided its shape yet. Then she stood with the fluid grace of someone who did everything physically well, gathered her books, and said, the first task is in 3 weeks. I know, he said. Are you prepared? Getting there, he said. She paused. If you need, she stopped. Restarted, with the specific precision of someone saying something they've talked themselves into. The Beauxbatons Library has records of the 1792 tournament. They are not available to other schools. If you wanted access, I could. She stopped again. I am not offering because I think you need help. I am offering because the tasks should be survived by everyone. He smiled. Thank you, Fleur. She looked at him when he said her name, really looked, the way people do when they hear something they weren't quite ready for. Then she walked away, and the silver of her hair caught the library light, and Victor Crumb, who had been 3 tables over the entire time and whom Nate had been quietly aware of for the whole conversation, lowered his book and gave Nate a look that was either respect or its adjacent territory. Nate nodded at him. Crumb nodded back. The first task came at the end of November. The champion's tent smelled like cold stone and nervous magic. He could hear the crowd above them, 10,000 people generating the specific low roar of collective excitement. He could hear the dragon, because of course it was dragons, the historical precedent was there if you looked, and the smell coming through the tent walls was old fire and animal musk, moving in its enclosure beyond the arena walls. Cedric went first. Harry went second, doing something extraordinary with Accio and a broomstick that Nate had helped him workshop over the previous week. Victor Crumb third, transfiguring the dragon's eyes with a precision that was, genuinely, impressive. Then Fleur, who produced a sleeping charm that half worked, was startled when the dragon woke, and still managed to retrieve her egg with a poise that kept the damage controlled. Then him. He walked into the arena with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the Hungarian horntail, the breed they'd saved for the fourth champion, the most aggressive, the one the keepers were most nervous about. It was 40 feet long, armored in black scales that caught the winter light, its tail spined and whipping with agitation, and it looked at him with the particular intelligence of a predator that had just identified something interesting. He stood completely still. The dragon looked at him. He looked at the dragon. He thought about what he knew about large predators, which was considerable, and about what he knew about chakra suppression, and about the specific qualities of stillness that distinguished threat from non-threat in the language of things that hunted. He breathed down his own presence, not hiding, exactly. More like becoming quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The horntail's tail stopped whipping. He moved, not fast, not dramatically, in a slow spiral that traced a wide arc around the dragon's position, keeping his eyes not on its eyes but on the ground between them, which was the correct posture in predator communication across most species in both worlds he'd inhabited. The dragon tracked him, its great head swiveling, but its posture was different now, still alert, still present, but reorganized from attack mode into something more like assessment. He got to the egg in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. He picked it up. He walked back out. The crowd made a sound that wasn't really a sound, more the absence of the sound that had been building and now didn't know where to go. Then the sound came, enormous, confused, and then rapidly enthusiastic. In the champion's tent afterward, Fleur stared at him. "You did not use your wand once," she said. "No," he said. "You communicated with a dragon." "I was polite," he said. "Most things respond to politeness if you do it in the right language." She stared at him for another 3 seconds. Then she said, in French, something that his language studies told him translated approximately as "this person is genuinely impossible," and then she laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, nothing like the polished social expression she typically deployed. It was a remarkable laugh. Unguarded, bright, the laugh of someone who wasn't performing anything. He filed it. He was going to think about that laugh for a while. That night, back in the castle, he found Daphne in the courtyard. She was standing by the far wall, looking at the sky, and she turned when she heard him coming with the lack of alarm of someone who had spent enough time in his company to be comfortable with his approach. "First place," she said. "Probably," he said. "The scores haven't been, you didn't use your wand," she said. "In front of 10,000 people." "Nate." "I know," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You're not bothered by that? By people knowing I can do things without a wand? By the attention it brings?" Dumbledore's attention. He was quiet for a moment. "Dumbledore's been watching me since first year," he said. "I'm not doing this differently because of what he thinks." She looked at the sky. After a moment she said, "My father told me this afternoon. He wants to know who you are." "What did you tell him?" "That you're someone worth knowing," she said, with the flat precision she used when she was saying something that had cost her something and wanted it to sound like nothing. He looked at her profile, the clean, composed lines of someone who kept their face as carefully as they kept their thoughts. The October cold had put color in her cheeks and she was looking at the stars with something in her expression that wasn't performing for anyone because she didn't know he was watching this closely. "Daphne," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "For that." She held his gaze. Then she said, very quietly, "Don't make me regret it." "I won't," he said. "Not a promise. A fact, delivered with the specific certainty of someone who had already decided what kind of person they were going to be in this life and stuck to it." She looked at him for a moment longer than she probably meant to. Then she looked back at the sky. They stood there in the cold, not talking, which was its own kind of conversation, and the stars were very bright and very far away, and somewhere in the castle Hermione was probably still working, and in the Beauxbatons carriage Fleur Delacour was probably still thinking about a boy who'd spoken to a dragon without saying a word. He stood in the cold night air and felt, with a clarity that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with having lived long enough to recognize it, that everything was beginning. Chapter 4, Queens Don't Kneel. The second task was water. He knew before the official clue was decoded, the egg's screaming underwater sound was enough to work from, and he'd had a clone sitting in a bath with the egg submerged for 6 hours before most champions had figured out they needed to try that. Mere people. Something taken. 1 hour. The lake in February, which meant water temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in 20 minutes and visibility close to zero beyond the first 30 feet of depth. He spent 3 weeks preparing for it with the systematic thoroughness that he applied to everything that wanted killing him. The underwater breathing problem was interesting. Gillyweed was the obvious solution. Neville had actually been the one to find it, bright-eyed and pleased with himself in the way he got when he'd done something genuinely useful, and Nate had taken the information and cross-referenced it against his own research before confirming it was the cleanest option available. But the gillyweed was backup. What he was actually working on was a water-breathing technique borrowed from something his previous body had done on a cellular level with chakra, forcing the body's oxygen extraction process to adapt to the available medium. Not gill formation. Something subtler. The magical equivalent of what certain meditation traditions called breath suspension, pushed further, into actual metabolic adaptation. He spent 3 weeks doing it wrong before he did it right for 30 seconds in the bath at 2 in the morning, and when it worked he sat back and stared at the ceiling with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has just confirmed that the impossible was a matter of framing. He kept the gillyweed in his pocket as backup. Hermione was the hostage. He found out the morning of the task, standing in the pre-dawn gray at the edge of the lake with the other champions while the tournament officials explained the mechanism. The thing most important to each champion had been taken and placed at the bottom of the lake. The champions had exactly an hour to retrieve it, and they should not worry because the hostages were perfectly safe, which was the kind of assurance that only concerned him more. He looked at the other champions' expressions when they heard their hostages named. Cedric, Cho-Chang. Krum, Hermione. His own, he hadn't processed it when it was announced because he was looking at Hermione's name on the list and reorganizing his approach. He'd assumed his hostage would be Harry. Harry was the obvious choice, closest friend, longest relationship. The tournament had instead decided that Hermione Granger was the thing most important to him, which was a conclusion he filed away to think about later, and which also meant that Krum and he were going to the same target. The cannon fired. He entered the water. He didn't use the gillyweed. The technique worked. Not perfectly, it was effortful in a way that physical techniques at the edge of their development always were, requiring continuous low-level concentration that meant he couldn't apply his full mind to navigation and threat assessment. But it worked, and he moved through the black water of the Scottish lake in February with his body doing the thing he'd trained it to do, going deeper as the ambient pressure built, following the sound of distant mere people activity that he'd mapped in his research. He moved fast. Faster than the lake expected of a human swimmer, not supernaturally fast, just the movement of a body trained past its apparent limits. He passed Cedric going the other direction at around the 15-minute mark and felt the other champion's startled magical signature as their paths crossed in the dark water. He reached the hostages in 22 minutes. They were arranged at the base of a stone structure in the Mere People village, for students, tethered by some combination of enchantment and kelp, unconscious but breathing in the specific way of magically sustained sleep. Hermione's hair floated around her like something alive. Gabrielle Delacour, Fleur's younger sister, he registered, small and very still, was beside her. Krum arrived 90 seconds after him, moving through the water in a half-transfigured shark form that was considerably less elegant than he'd probably intended but was functionally fast. He stopped when he saw Nate already there, already assessing the tethering mechanism. They looked at each other through black water. Then Krum moved to Hermione, his hostage, and Nate moved to Gabrielle. This was not his assigned hostage. The tournament rules said champions were only responsible for their own. He knew that. He was also looking at a child of about 8 years old who was at the bottom of a frozen lock in February and whose sister was currently probably on the surface unable to complete the task because the gillyweed had failed her. He untethered Gabrielle and Hermione simultaneously, because he was Nate and he had 2 free hands and unlimited opinions about what the rules of a competition had to do with what a person ought to do. Crumb looked at him as he took both girls. Nate held Gabrielle against his chest with one arm, used his other hand to steady Hermione as Crumb took her, and jerked his head upward. Crumb nodded once, the sharp economy of someone who understood the situation and had made his assessment of the person he was dealing with, and they went up together. The Mare People did not stop them. The Mare People chief, who had been watching from a distance the entire time, made a sound that might have been approval in Mermish and might have been something else entirely. He surfaced with Gabrielle in his arms to a roar from the lakeshore crowd and Fleur Delacour's voice cutting through everything else on the bank, not words, just sound, the specific broken note that a person makes when they see something they've been afraid for turn out to be safe. He got to the shallows, found his footing on the lake bed, and walked out of the water with Gabrielle already stirring back to consciousness. Fleur was there before he'd gotten 3 steps out of the shallows. She went to her knees in the mud without any apparent thought for her robes or her composure or anything except her sister, and she took Gabrielle from him and held her with the desperate grip of someone who has been afraid and is now not and doesn't know what to do with the transition. Then she looked up at him from the ground. Silver blonde hair soaked flat, robes ruined, mud on her knees, and an expression on her face that was nothing at all like the composed Beauxbatons champion who had walked into the champion's tent in November. This was just Fleur, something open and real and briefly entirely undefended. "You didn't have to," she said. Her voice was rough. "She was there," he said. "She wasn't she was there," he said again, simply, because that was the whole of it. She had been there and she had been alone and he had been present to do something about it. There was nothing more complicated than that. Fleur looked at him. He was standing in the shallows in February, soaked through, water running off him in sheets, and he was not particularly cold because he'd been doing cold exposure training for 3 years, and he looked at her steadily the way he looked at everything, clear, present, without agenda. Something happened in Fleur Delacour's expression that he suspected she was not fully aware of. Something settled. Something that had been held taut for a long time eased by about a degree, the way a held breath releases when you stop needing it. Hermione appeared at his shoulder, dripping, furious in the specific way she got when she was frightened and the fright had converted. "You went for Gabrielle," she said. "That wasn't, I know," he said. "You could have gotten full points just getting your own, Hermione," he said. She was 8 years old. At the bottom of a lake. Hermione stopped. Looked at him. The furious energy shifted into something quieter, the specific look she got when something recalibrated her model. "You're impossible," she said. "So I've been told," he said. She grabbed his arm, briefly, with both hands, the grip of someone who has just processed that something could have gone badly and is being physical about their relief before their brain catches up with their composure. Then she let go and pushed her sopping hair out of her face and turned to the bank with all the dignity available to someone who had just been rescued from a lake. He watched her go, then looked back at Fleur, who was still on the ground with Gabrielle, and found that Fleur was watching Hermione walk away with an expression he hadn't seen on her yet, thoughtful, quiet, without the armor. She looked back at him. "She cares very much about you," Fleur said. "I know," he said. "And the Greengrass girl," Fleur said. "I have noticed how she looks at you." "Have you?" he said. "I notice things," she said. She stood, gathering Gabrielle against her side, and she was Fleur again, composed, elegant, even mud-kneed. But the thing that had opened was still slightly open, and he could see it. "What do you notice," he said, "when you look at me?" She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. "Someone I have not figured out yet," she said. "Which is," she paused. "Unusual." "Good unusual or bad unusual," he said, using the same question he'd asked her in the library. Her chin came up and she almost smiled, not quite, but close, the architecture of a real smile visible under the composure. "I am still not certain," she said. "I will tell you when I am." She walked up the bank with her sister. He stood in the shallows for another moment, in the cold, and let the February air do what it wanted to him while the crowd above sorted itself out and the tournament officials debated his scores. He scored higher than full marks. The judges argued about it for 10 minutes and settled on a number that was more than anyone else had received for the task. He accepted it without particular interest. Dumbledore caught his eye across the judges' table. The old man's expression was, as usual, warm and specific in telling him something he'd have to decode. Today it said, "I am watching you very carefully, and I am not as certain as I would like to be about what I am watching." Nate nodded at him pleasantly and went to find dry clothes. March. The tournaments break between second and third tasks. The castle and the specific early spring quality of cold giving way to almost warmth, the grounds brown-green, the air smelling of things beginning. His relationship with all three of them had developed over the winter months into something that he could feel had moved past the beginning stages into something more substantial, more real, the kind of thing that develops in the space between people who have been genuinely honest with each other long enough for it to matter. Hermione had stopped pretending she wasn't spending extra time in his vicinity. She'd started doing it openly, showing up in the room of requirement for study sessions, walking back from the library with him in the evenings, appearing at his shoulder in the great hall with the air of someone claiming a seat that was already theirs. She'd always been forthright about intellectual things. She was learning to be forthright about personal things too, and he could see it happening, the careful extension of a person who had kept most of herself for a long time. She challenged him constantly, which was the thing he valued most about her. She read everything he recommended and came back with 3 counter-arguments and a list of follow-up questions. She was wrong about things in ways that were interesting to be wrong about, and she acknowledged being wrong with increasing grace, as though she was practicing it deliberately. She was probably practicing it deliberately. That was very Hermione. She said to him once, on an evening in late March when they were in the room of requirement and the room had made itself into something between a study and a greenhouse, climbing plants up one wall, warm light from somewhere overhead, "I keep trying to categorize you and I keep running out of categories." "Is that frustrating?" he said. "Enormously," she said. "And also," she stopped. "And also," he said. She looked at her book. "And also not," she said, which was the most she was going to give him on that line and he knew it, so he let it settle where it landed and watched her profile in the plant-filtered light and thought that she was, in every meaningful sense, remarkable. With Daphne, things were different in texture. The sessions in the courtyard had become evenings, and the evenings had expanded their topics from magical theory to everything, her family, his training, the political landscape of the British magical world, books they were both reading, questions they couldn't answer. She spoke more than she used to. Her composure was still there, it wasn't something she was going to put down, but it had become more flexible, less like armor and more like posture. A choice rather than a defense. She touched his arm once in February, briefly, when she'd been telling him something about Astoria and her voice had done the thing it did when she was saying more than she intended, and he'd been still and present the way he always was, and she'd put her hand on his forearm for about 3 seconds and then removed it with the precision of someone who had decided to do the thing and then done it and was not going to discuss it. He had not discussed it. He'd simply turned slightly toward her and continued the conversation, and the quality of the silence between them afterward had been new. Fleur had begun finding reasons to be in the castle. The champions had access to the library and certain common areas, and she used that access with an increasing specificity that was pointed in his direction without being obvious about it. She brought him a book from the Beauxbatons records on advanced elemental magic, not because he'd asked, though he had been interested in the subject, but because she'd noticed he was interested and decided to do something about it, which was a form of attention that she apparently gave very rarely and that he received without making a production of it. They talked. Really talked, about things that mattered, about growing up with something that defined how every person around you responded to you before you'd opened your mouth, about what it meant to be good at something in a world that wanted to own the thing you were good at. She talked about France, about her grandmother, about the specific loneliness of being beautiful in a way that made people afraid. He talked about loss and rebuilding and the strange duality of carrying two lives in one body, which he framed carefully but honestly, and she listened with the full attention of someone who found something in his words that mapped to her own experience without being asked to. "You know what it is," she said to him, in the library on a Thursday in March, in the French they'd started moving between languages with, because her English was excellent and his French was improving rapidly through clone study, and she found it interesting to watch him work in her language, to be something that makes people react before they know you. "Yes," he said. "And you do not let it make you smaller," she said. "No," he said. "I decided early not to." "How?" she said, with the directness of someone genuinely asking, not performing interest. "Because the people who wanted to make me smaller," he said, "were not people whose opinion I'd chosen to value." She looked at him with those blue eyes, and something crossed her face that he recognized now, the specific expression she got when something reached past her surface and touched something real. She looked away, out the library window, at the grounds in early spring. "I like that," she said, quietly. "I know," he said. "That's why I said it." She looked back sharply. Then, catching his expression, she laughed, that unguarded, bright laugh again, the one he'd first heard in the champion's tent after the first task. It was becoming one of his favorite sounds in this life. April. The tournament third task date announced. A maze. The Triwizard Cup at the center. He prepared with the same systematic focus, running clones through maze navigation theory, practicing magical combat at speed, drilling the specific responses that a controlled environment designed by someone else's agenda would require. He worked with Hermione on magical counter theory, what you could expect from a maze constructed by tournament officials aiming for maximum challenge. He also began feeling, in the way that a person feels things when their threat assessment instincts are well calibrated, that something was wrong. Not with the tournament specifically. With the tournament's context. With Moody, the defense professor this year, whose eye and whose instincts were both wrong in ways he'd been cataloging since September, the specific wrongness of a person who was performing someone else's patterns. With the tension in Dumbledore's behavior that had increased incrementally since February. With the way certain adults were moving around the edges of his awareness like people who knew something was coming and were managing the shape of their knowledge. Voldemort. He knew the history. He knew how the story was supposed to go. And he had absolutely no intention of letting Harry Potter navigate it the way the original trajectory suggested he was going to, which was alone and blindsided and nearly dead. He told Harry on a Sunday evening in April, sitting in the empty Gryffindor common room after everyone else had gone to bed. He told him everything, what he suspected about Moody, what he suspected was happening at a level the tournament's official structure didn't cover, what he thought the third task was going to be used for. Harry listened. He'd gotten better at listening, not the wide-eyed, slightly overwhelmed listening of first year, but the measured, following attention of someone who had been in enough situations that he trusted people who thought carefully about them. "You've known this since when?" he said. "Suspected since February," Nate said. "Confident since last week." "And Dumbledore?" "Knows something," Nate said. "Doesn't know all of it. Or knows all of it and is planning something that requires letting it proceed." Harry's jaw tightened. He'd had enough experience with Dumbledore's chess playing to find the second option plausible and infuriating. "What do we do?" "I'm going to be in the maze with you," Nate said. "I go in first on point standings, you're second. When we're inside, we move toward the cup together. If anyone or anything attempts to make you touch it alone, I am between that and you." Harry looked at him. "You'd forfeit your own chance at the cup." "I don't care about the cup," Nate said, with the flat simplicity of someone who had meant to say exactly that. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nate. You know I can handle." "I know you can," Nate said. "I'm not offering because I think you can't. I'm offering because you shouldn't have to do it alone. There's a difference." He paused. Let people help you. It's not weakness. Harry looked at the fire. Something shifted in his expression, not capitulation, the more valuable thing, genuine acceptance. Okay, he said. Okay, Nate said. They sat in the common room for another hour, not talking much, which was the right way to sit with a decision that mattered. The maze went sideways fast. It always did. That was the nature of environments designed by someone with a specific outcome in mind. They were optimized for that outcome, and any variable that hadn't been accounted for disrupted the optimization unpredictably. He was a variable that hadn't been accounted for. He moved through the maze with his senses fully extended, monitoring the magic of the hedges, the ground, the air, the specific signatures of the obstacles placed at intervals. He cleared 3 obstacles in the first 15 minutes, a blast-ended script he redirected with a wandless push that sent it crashing into the hedge wall, a golden mist of confusion he walked through by keeping his eyes on the chakra sense ground rather than his visual field, and a sphinx whose riddle he answered in about 4 seconds because it was a straightforward lateral thinking problem and he'd been doing those since he was 8. He found Harry at a 4-way junction 20 minutes in, moving purposefully but showing the tension of someone who'd already dealt with more than one nasty surprise. They exchanged a look that contained most of a conversation and moved together from there. He felt the Cruciatus curse a second before it hit, the specific magical signature of dark magic incoming at speed, and he was already moving, stepping left and pulling Harry with him, and the curse hit the hedge where Harry's back had been and turned the greenery black. Crumb was at the junction behind them. But it wasn't Crumb, the eyes were wrong, the posture was wrong, the specific quality of controlled intent was entirely absent and something else had replaced it. Imperious. The moody substitute had gotten to Crumb before the maze. He said, "Down," to Harry, who went down immediately, and he closed the distance to Crumb in 4 strides and put 2 fingers against the other champion's temple, not to hurt, to locate the Imperious's anchor point, which in magical terms felt like a hook set in specific gray matter tissue, and pushed. Not a counter-curse. Something more direct. The kind of internal pressure that came from pushing pure intent through a precise contact point, the thing that wasn't quite magic and wasn't quite chakra but lived in the territory between, the thing he'd been developing for 3 years in the spaces between known disciplines. Crumb's eyes cleared. He blinked. He looked at Nate, then at Harry on the ground, then at his own wand with the expression of someone returning from somewhere they'd been taken against their will and finding the landscape disorienting. "You're okay," Nate said. "Stay down. Someone will find you." Crumb grabbed his arm as he turned. "The cup," Crumb said, his voice rough. "It is a trap." "I know," Nate said. "Stay down." He and Harry moved toward the cup. The false Moody, Bartemius Crouch Jr., he'd confirmed the identity weeks ago through patient observation, was waiting at the cup. He'd gotten there by another route, and he had his wand on Cedric, who was on the ground but conscious. The cup was 10 feet away, glowing blue-gold in the center of the maze's clearing. Crouch's face when he saw both of them was the face of a plan encountering a wall it hadn't known was there. The moody disguise flickered, the potion wearing thin or the distraction of surprise doing it, and underneath was a younger man with eyes that were fevered and bright with the specific brightness of someone whose devotion to something had consumed everything around it. "Uzumaki-Black," Crouch said, and his voice was Crouch's voice now, not Moody's. He had his wand on Cedric and his attention split between multiple targets in the way that split attention always failed eventually. "You shouldn't be here." "I hear that a lot," Nate said. He was calculating Cedric's position, Harry's position 3 steps to his left, Crouch's wand angle, the distance to the cup, the distance to the opening in the hedge behind them. "You should let Cedric go. He's not what you need." "What I need," Crouch said, "is one of you to touch that cup." "You need Harry specifically," Nate said. "The ritual requires his blood. Mine won't do." Crouch's eyes went to Harry and Nate moved, not fast in the visible, dramatic sense, but in the specific quality of movement that was faster than it looked because it came from exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. He had Crouch's wand hand at the wrist and he had Crouch's elbow bent backward at an angle that wasn't comfortable, and Crouch's wand was in the hedge, and Crouch was on his knees in approximately 2 seconds. He held him there. Crouch fought. He was strong, genuinely strong, the desperate strength of someone who had everything staked on this moment, and Nate held him with the patient certainty of someone for whom this was an amount of force that did not require effort. "Harry," he said. "Get Cedric. Touch the cup together. Go back." "What about, go," he said. "Not urgently. Just clearly." Harry went. He pulled Cedric to his feet, and they touched the cup simultaneously, and the port key took them in the rush of blue-white light that left the clearing suddenly much quieter. He looked down at Crouch. The man had stopped fighting, not from defeat, but from the recalculation of someone who had recognized that the exit strategy of the plan was no longer available. Something moved through his expression that was complicated and genuine and not at all simple. Devotion. The specific terrible devotion of someone who had given everything to a person or an idea and had built their entire identity in that direction. "He's already gone," Crouch said. His voice was flat. "Not yet," Nate said. "But that's done." Crouch looked up at him. "You don't understand what he is." "I understand what devotion without judgment looks like," Nate said. "I understand what happens when you love something so much you stop being able to see it clearly." He paused. "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you made choices a long time ago that you couldn't unmake." Crouch stared at him. Whatever he'd expected from this conversation, it hadn't been this. "That doesn't change what I have to do," Nate said. He held him until Dumbledore arrived, which took 4 minutes. 4 minutes in which Crouch alternated between silence and half-formed things that weren't quite defenses and weren't quite confessions. When the headmaster came through the hedge opening with McGonagall and 2 Aurors behind him, he stopped and looked at Nate holding Crouch on his knees in the clearing. The blue eyes moved over the scene. Over the wand in the hedge. Over Nate's completely unhurried posture. Over everything that the scene implied about how it had happened. "Nate," Dumbledore said, in the specific tone of a man asking a question without words. "Bartemius Crouch Jr., Nate said. Polyjuice, Moody's been in the cellar of his office since August. The whole year. He's alive. You'll want a Medowitch." Dumbledore was still for a moment. Just a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Get Professor Sprout." McGonagall was already moving. Dumbledore looked at Nate steadily, and Nate looked back, and between them was a conversation that neither of them was going to have right now but that both of them knew was coming. "Are you hurt?" Dumbledore said. "No," Nate said. "The other champions?" "Cedric is with Harry. Krum is alive in the northeast quadrant of the maze, recovering from Imperius. He should be found quickly." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. Simple. Genuine. The specific sincerity of a person who is grateful and also complicated about what they're grateful for. "Don't thank me yet," Nate said. "Voldemort's back. Or he's about to be. Whatever Crouch was trying to set up tonight failed here, but the goal didn't." The name didn't make Dumbledore flinch, it never had, he was one of the few, but his expression shifted, sharpened, something moving behind the warmth of his eyes. "I know," he said. "I know you know," Nate said. "We should talk. Soon. And the conversation should be honest in both directions." Dumbledore looked at him with those eyes that had seen more than almost anyone alive. "You are 14 years old," he said. Not dismissively. Observationally, with something beneath it that sounded almost like wonder. "My age is the least interesting thing about me," Nate said. Dumbledore, after a pause, smiled. "Yes," he said. "I am beginning to understand that." Harry came back. He came back through the cup's return transport with Cedric's body and the truth about Voldemort in the graveyard and something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, not the scar on his forehead but something internal, the specific kind of mark that certain experiences leave that don't show on the outside. Nate found him in the hospital wing after the immediate crisis had been handled, after Fudge had been and gone with his denial and his inadequacy worn publicly, after the school had processed the surface of what had happened with the varying degrees of understanding available to people who didn't know the full truth. He sat beside Harry's bed. Harry was awake, staring at the ceiling. "Tell me," Nate said. Harry told him. "All of it. The graveyard, the ritual, Cedric, the priori incantatum, the shadows of the dead speaking from Voldemort's wand." He told it flatly, in the way people tell things they're still processing, and Nate listened with complete attention and complete stillness. When Harry finished, they were quiet for a while. "I should have been there," Nate said. "You couldn't have, I know," he said. "But I should have been." Harry looked at him. "You saved Cedric. You got Crouch." "I didn't save, you did," Harry said, with more force. "If you hadn't been there, in the maze, Nate, I don't know what would have happened." He paused. "You don't have to fix everything." "I know I don't," Nate said. "I want to." Harry smiled, the first real one since he'd come back. Small, rough at the edges, but real. "Yeah," he said. "I know." They sat in the hospital wing together until Madame Pomfrey eventually chased Nate out, and he went quietly without argument because Harry needed sleep and Madame Pomfrey was not someone he was going to fight about this. He found them in the corridor outside, all three of them, which he hadn't expected and which stopped him for a second. Hermione, who had clearly been there for some time and had the specific look of someone who had been managing her fear by staying close to the problem. Daphne, who was in Slytherin robes and had no obvious reason to be in this corridor and was standing with the composed stillness of someone who had come here deliberately and was not going to explain herself. And Fleur, who was still at Hogwarts for the tournament's conclusion and who was standing slightly apart from the other two with her arms crossed and her expression doing the thing it did when she was feeling something she wasn't ready to name. He looked at all three of them. "He's going to be okay," he said. Hermione's breath came out. Daphne's shoulders moved by a degree. Fleur closed her eyes briefly. "And you?" Hermione said. Her voice was controlled and under it was three things she wasn't saying. "I'm fine," he said. "You were in there for, Hermione." He said her name the way he always said it when she was running 3 steps ahead of her own feeling, direct, warm, specific. "I'm here. I'm fine. I promise." She looked at him. Then she crossed the distance between them and hugged him, briefly, fiercely, with both arms, the grip of someone who had been afraid and was converting it into something physical because that was the only option that felt equal to the feeling. He put his arms around her and held her with the same steadiness he applied to everything, and after a moment she stepped back and straightened her robes and looked at the wall with the air of someone who had done something and was not going to address it. He looked at Daphne. She was watching him with those gray eyes that were clear and open and the armor was exactly nowhere. "You're actually fine," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. 1 syllable. The whole of what she was feeling compressed into it. He held her gaze and let her see that he understood. She gave him the smallest nod. He looked at Fleur. She had uncrossed her arms. She was standing differently, less the composed champion, more the person he'd seen on the lakeshore with mud on her knees and everything open. She looked at him for a long moment. "I was afraid," she said, in French, quietly. The admission of it, in her first language, with no armor around it. "I know," he said, in French. "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't be sorry for being," she stopped, searching. "Don't be sorry for being what you are." "Which is what?" he said. She looked at him with those blue eyes in the corridor outside the hospital wing, at the end of a year that had taken them from strangers to something he didn't have a name for yet but recognized the shape of. "Someone worth being afraid for," she said. The corridor was quiet around them. Somewhere in the castle, the school was winding down from a night that would mark everything that came after it. And here, in this specific corridor, at this specific moment, he was standing in front of 3 people who had each come to this spot for the same reason, in their own ways, in their own languages. He looked at all 3 of them. He thought about the mirror of Eriste and the image it had shown him, and about how images in mirrors were always slightly simplified and how the real thing, when it arrived, was always more complicated and more true. "Come on," he said. "Let's find somewhere warm. All 4 of us." Hermione looked at Daphne. Daphne looked at Fleur. Fleur looked at Hermione. Something moved between them, not competition, not yet its opposite either, but the first shape of a triangle becoming something else, something with more sides and therefore more stable. Daphne raised one elegant eyebrow at him. "You planned this," she said. "I didn't," he said honestly. "But I'm not complaining." She pressed her lips together against something that was very nearly a smile. They followed him. Chapter 5, The Shadow King Rises. Summer ended and 5th year began the way things began after a war had quietly restarted, with denial at the top and dread at the bottom and everyone in the middle doing the exhausting work of pretending the ground wasn't shifting under them. The Ministry had made their position clear. Voldemort was not back. Harry Potter was a disturbed attention-seeking boy. Dumbledore was a manipulative old man past his usefulness. The Daily Prophet had been running variations of that story for 2 months, and by the time the Hogwarts Express left King's Cross in September the narrative had calcified into something that most of the wizarding world was treating as settled fact, because settled facts were considerably more comfortable than the alternative. Nate read the Summer's Prophet issues in a single sitting on the train north, stacking them in chronological order and reading them the way he read everything, for what was said, what was omitted, and what the gap between those 2 things revealed. When he was done he folded the last issue precisely and set it on the seat beside him and looked out the window at England going green. "Well?" Hermione said. She was across from him, her own stack of research already organized beside her, watching him with the expression she wore when she'd already reached a conclusion and wanted to know if he'd reached the same one. "Fudge is afraid," he said. "Not stupid, afraid. There's a difference. Stupid people make random errors. Afraid people make consistent ones in the direction of whatever they're afraid of." "He's afraid of losing power," she said. "He's afraid of the war," Nate said. "Losing power is a symptom. The Ministry spent 10 years rebuilding after the last one. Fudge was part of that rebuilding. Accepting that it's starting again means accepting that everything he built might not survive it." He paused. "That's a harder thing to accept than it sounds." Hermione looked at him. "You almost sound sympathetic." "Understanding something isn't the same as agreeing with it," he said. "Fudge is going to be a genuine problem regardless of why he's doing it." She nodded, turning to her notes. "Umbridge is the practical problem. Have you read her educational decree record?" "Read it twice," he said. "She's the mechanism. Fudge provides the political cover and she provides the implementation. She's going to be defense teacher. She's going to be Ministry spy first and defense teacher second," he said. "The distinction matters." Daphne, who had found their compartment at the border with Wales and had sat down without ceremony, she'd been doing that since 4th year, the quiet assumption of a space she'd decided was hers, looked up from her own book. She'd spent the summer corresponding with him twice weekly, letters that had begun as information exchange and gradually become something warmer, though she wrote warmth the way she did everything, precisely, with the minimum required words for maximum clarity, which meant every warm thing she said landed with the weight of something carefully chosen. "The Greengrass position on the Fudge situation," she said, without looking up, "is publicly neutral." "And privately," he said. "Privately, my father thinks Fudge is a bureaucrat who found himself in a crisis beyond his competence and is now actively creating the conditions for a catastrophic failure." She turned a page. "Which is more or less what you said, but in more diplomatic language. Your father sounds like a sensible man." "He is," she said. He is also a man who has made his bed in a political landscape that is actively becoming uninhabitable, and he knows it, and he is not yet sure what to do about that. He looked at her. She was reading, her expression composed, but he'd been reading Daphne Greengrass for 2 years now, and the composed expression had layers he could see through when the light was right. She was worried about her father. She was worried about what the coming year meant for a family positioned exactly where the Greengrasses were positioned, too prominent to be invisible, too pragmatic to be ideologically committed, caught in the middle of a conflict that was not going to reward the middle. "He should come talk to me," Nate said. She looked up. "Excuse me?" "Your father," he said. "He should come talk to me." She looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once. "You're 15, she said. "I'm aware," he said. "My father is a smart man in a difficult position who needs a different perspective," Nate said. "I have one. The offer stands." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression, not surprise exactly, because she'd been past surprise at him for over a year. More like the specific feeling of someone watching a person they care about be exactly the thing that made them start caring in the first place. "I'll tell him," she said, and went back to her book. Dolores Umbridge arrived with the smile of a woman who had been given permission to do something she'd been wanting to do for a long time, and the particular quality of her smile, wide, pink, fixed, was the smile of someone who liked their power most when other people were visibly aware of it. She set the tone in her first lesson. Theoretical only. Ministry-approved material. No practical magic. No actual defense instruction. He sat in the back of the classroom and read her course materials with the detached interest of a man cataloging the specific ways in which something was designed to fail, and when she asked him a question halfway through the lesson, with the smile and the fixed eyes, the pointed you-at-the-back quality of a teacher making an example, he answered it fully, correctly, and then said, pleasantly, "Although the ministry's position on the threat level seems inconsistent with the available evidence." The smile stayed exactly the same. Which was its own kind of answer. "The ministry," Umbridge said, "provides an accurate assessment of the current threat environment." "I'm sure they do their best," he said. She looked at him for a moment that had a very specific quality, the moment of assessment that certain kinds of authority figures go through when they encounter something they can't immediately categorize. He smiled back at her with the cheerful patience of someone who had outsat considerably worse. She moved on. Harry got a week's detention for stating Voldemort had returned. He came back from the first session with marks on the back of his hand, and Nate saw them when Harry set his hand on the table at breakfast, and the thing that moved through him in the 3 seconds before he had his expression under control was not anger exactly, it was colder than anger, more precise, the specific feeling of someone who has identified a line that has been crossed and is now calculating response. He helped Harry heal the marks with a tissue regeneration technique he'd developed from the medical ninjutsu principles of his previous life, translated into this world's magical idiom. Harry sat across from him in the room of requirement and watched his hand heal with an expression of exhausted gratitude that Nate found harder to look at than the marks themselves. "She needs to stop," Harry said. "She will," Nate said. "How?" "We're going to build something," Nate said. "That's how." Harry looked at him. "Dumbledore's army?" Nate raised an eyebrow. "You've been thinking about this." "Hermione's been thinking about it," Harry said. "And talking to me about it." "Smart woman," Nate said. "She said you'd already mapped out approximately the same idea from a different angle." "We think similarly," Nate said, which was not a complete answer, and Harry's expression acknowledged that. "There's something else," Harry said, and his voice dropped, the specific drop of someone who's been sitting on something. "Dumbledore's been avoiding me. All summer, and now here. He won't look at me directly." Nate was quiet for a moment. He knew why, had worked it out over the summer from the pattern of behavior and what he understood of the old man's reasoning. Dumbledore was afraid of the connection between Harry and Voldemort, afraid of Voldemort using it to see or influence Harry, and was managing that fear by reducing the connection points. Which was not wrong as protective instincts went, but was being executed in a way that was isolating Harry at the worst possible time. "He's trying to protect you," he said. "The execution is bad. The intention is real." "That's very generous," Harry said, with an edge. "It's accurate," Nate said. "I'm not defending the method. I'm just telling you the reason, because knowing the reason means you can work around it." He paused. "Let me talk to him." Harry looked at him. "You're going to talk to Dumbledore about his approach to managing my psychological welfare?" "Yes," Nate said. I know who he is," Nate said. "I'm also not particularly intimidated by impressive people who are doing something wrong." Harry was quiet. Then he said, "You know what's weird? I actually believe that'll work." "It'll work well enough," Nate said. "Come on. We have an army to build." Dumbledore's army formed over 3 meetings and became something real by the 4th. Hermione had done the organizational work with the thoroughness she applied to everything she cared about, the sign-up list and the logistics and the careful framing that gave people a way to participate without feeling like they were committing to something irreversible. Harry provided the authentic credibility, a boy who had survived things and could teach what survival felt like from the inside. And Nate provided the structure. He didn't take the front of the room. That was Harry's space, and Harry was genuinely good at it, better than he probably knew, with a quality of instruction that was direct and clear and came from the specific authority of someone who had actually done the thing. Nate worked the perimeter, moving between students who were struggling, making adjustments with the economy of a teacher who identified the exact error rather than the symptom of the error. He was working with Neville on the Expelliarmus. Neville was consistently wand-arming at the wrong moment, a timing issue that looked like a technique issue and kept getting treated as a technique issue by everyone who tried to help him before, when he understood what was happening and said, "Stop thinking about the spell. Think about the moment just before the spell. There's a half-second window." Neville looked at him. "What do I do in the window?" "Breathe," he said. "Let your body know the intention before your arm does." Neville tried it. The spell fired clean and disarmed his practice partner across the room with a crack that made several people look over. Neville stared at his own wand. That's what it feels like when it's right," Nate said. "Remember that." Neville nodded. Something in his expression was different from the expression he usually wore, the faint surprised quality of someone who has been told they can do something and then discovered the something is true. He moved on. He helped Ginny with a body rotation issue in her stunning spell. He showed Luna, who had joined with the serene certainty of someone who had decided the thing was correct and therefore would attend, a wandless focusing technique that Luna received with the specific quality of someone for whom unusual information was simply information. He spent 20 minutes with Ron on the specific problem of casting under pressure, which Ron's instincts made difficult because his instincts were to speed up when he was stressed, and the spells that required finesse didn't reward speeding. "Slow down," he told Ron. "I know it feels wrong. Do it anyway." "Feels like giving up," Ron said. "Feels like it," Nate agreed. "Isn't. Slow down under pressure is a skill. Takes practice." Ron practiced. It didn't fully fix the problem in one session, but it was the right direction, and Ron had the stubbornness to work a direction once he'd decided it was correct. Hermione watched him work the room with an expression he caught twice. The second time she didn't look away when he noticed, and what was in her expression was something warm and direct and no longer pretending to be something simpler. He crossed the room to her at the end of the session, when the others were gathering their things. She was standing by the wall, arms folded, watching the room clear. "You're a good teacher," she said. "I had good ones," he said. "Where?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely curious, the curiosity she had toward the parts of him she hadn't been able to categorize yet. "Somewhere else," he said. "A long time ago." She looked at him. She did that thing sometimes, just looked, with the full weight of her intelligence pointed at him without any specific question attached, like she was trying to read something that was written in a language she almost knew. "I'm going to figure you out eventually," she said. I know, he said. I'm looking forward to it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, that's the most interesting thing you've ever said to me. I have a lot of interesting things, he said. I know, she said, and her voice had changed quality, quieter, less armored, the specific register she used when she wasn't managing what she was saying. That's the problem. He smiled. She pressed her lips together against something, then looked away. But she was still smiling at the wall. He went to Dumbledore in October. He requested the meeting through McGonagall, who looked at him with those sharp eyes and said nothing and sent the request. Dumbledore responded within 6 hours, which was either impressively fast or indicated that he'd been waiting for it. The headmaster's office was exactly what he'd expected, full, warm, layered with the accumulated significance of a long life dedicated to a particular kind of work. The portraits. The instruments. The pensive. Fawkes, who looked at him from his perch with bright eyes and made no sound. Dumbledore was at his desk and gestured toward the chair across from him with the courtesy of a man receiving a guest. Nate, he said. I wondered when this would happen. I've been letting you calibrate, Nate said, sitting. You needed time to decide how much you already knew about me. The blue eyes warmed. And what have I decided? That I'm not a threat, Nate said. And that I'm not going to be managed. And that both of those things are true simultaneously, which is a combination you find genuinely interesting and also mildly inconvenient. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. You know, he said, I have been headmaster of this school for a very long time. I have met remarkable students in that time, students who became remarkable adults. But I have never met a student of whom I could not, given enough observation, construct a reasonably accurate predictive model. Until me, Nate said. Until you, Dumbledore agreed. He folded his hands on the desk. Would you like to tell me why? No, Nate said. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on how this conversation goes. Dumbledore raised an eyebrow. That is a frank position. I'm a frank person, Nate said. I think you know that. What I want to talk about is Harry. The warmth in the old man's eyes shifted, complicated now, the expression of someone whose most guarded subject has been named. Harry, he said. You're isolating him, Nate said. I understand why. The connection to Voldemort, you're afraid of what Voldemort can see through it, and you're managing that by reducing your contact with Harry to reduce the risk of Voldemort finding information through the connection. That's the reasoning. Dumbledore was very still. That is, accurate, Nate said. And wrong. Not the threat assessment, the management approach. You believe, Harry is 15 years old, Nate said, and he has just watched a classmate die in front of him and been used as a blood sacrifice in a resurrection ritual. He came back from that and found out that the ministry is calling him a liar and his headmaster won't look at him. The isolation isn't protecting him from the connection. It's leaving him alone with it. Dumbledore was quiet. Fawkes made a soft sound from his perch. The connection is going to be a problem regardless, Nate continued. Isolating Harry doesn't solve the connection, it just means he faces it without support. Which makes him more vulnerable, not less. The silence in the office was the particular silence of a very intelligent person receiving an argument they can't counter. Dumbledore looked at the desk. His hands had unclenched slightly. You are, he said finally, quite right. I know, Nate said, without heat. Dumbledore looked at him. What would you have me do? Talk to him, Nate said. Actually talk to him. Not briefings. Not instructions. Talk to him like he's a person in a specific situation who needs information and support, not like he's a piece on a board that needs to be correctly positioned. He paused. He's not a piece. He's Harry. He's actually extraordinary, and you know that better than anyone, and you're treating him like he's fragile. He's not fragile, Nate said. He's been through things that would break most adults and he's still standing. The fragility you're seeing is loneliness. That's different, and it has a different solution. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. The portraits around the office were very quiet. Outside the high windows, the sky was October gray and indifferent. You care for him a great deal, Dumbledore said. He's my friend, Nate said. In both the ordinary sense and every other sense. I see, Dumbledore said, and his voice had changed quality, less the headmaster managing a variable, more the old man who had spent too long treating everything as a variable. I will speak with him. Good, Nate said. He moved to stand, then stopped. One more thing. Yes. The thing you're planning, Nate said carefully. The thing you haven't told anyone yet. The larger thing, not the DA, not the ministry situation, the thing that sits underneath all of it. Dumbledore's eyes sharpened. What makes you believe, because you're the kind of man who always has a plan at every level simultaneously, Nate said, and I've been watching you work for 4 years and I know the difference between your operational face and your strategic face, and right now you're wearing your strategic face even in moments when there's nothing visible to be strategic about. Which means the strategy is happening at a level I can't see yet. He held the old man's gaze. When you're ready to talk about it, I'm ready to listen. But I need it to be a conversation, not a briefing. I'm not going to be a piece on your board either. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long moment. No, he said finally, and his voice was quiet and genuine. No, I don't imagine you are. Nate left. The stone corridor outside the office was cold and familiar, and he walked back toward Gryffindor Tower with his hands in his pockets and his mind turning over the conversation, cataloging what he'd gotten and what he hadn't and what he still needed. It was a beginning. It wasn't enough, but beginnings rarely were. November deepened and Umbridge tightened. Educational decree after educational decree, each one contracting the space available to students and staff by another increment, the specific methodology of someone who understood that institutional control was most effective when it was applied gradually. He watched it with the patient attention of someone who knew this pattern, had seen versions of it in every power structure he'd ever been adjacent to, and built his counter-response accordingly. He was running 8 clones simultaneously by November. 8. The energy cost was significant. He'd been sleeping 7 hours instead of 6 to compensate for the nightly drain, but the capacity was extraordinary. 8 independent minds with his full capability, working on 8 different problems simultaneously, feeding back to him in the quiet hours of early morning in a rush of accumulated information that had become as natural as breathing. He used 3 for DA theory and tactical development. 2 for advanced magical research that he was pursuing on lines that didn't have established literature to follow. 1 for physical training in the pre-dawn hours. 1 for monitoring the political situation through careful reading and observation. 1 for correspondence. He was also, with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood what they were doing, building a network. Not dramatically. Not visibly. He'd been watching Neville's growing confidence, Ginny's natural tactical instinct, Luna's specific brand of perception that caught things that conventional observation missed. He watched the DA members who were becoming genuinely capable and the ones who needed different support. He watched the older students, the 6th and 7th years who had the most immediate stake in what was coming and the least structural support for dealing with it. He found Lee Jordan in the library in early November, working on something that wasn't homework. Lee was creative and technically sharp and had, Nate had noticed, been doing things with the wireless enchantment principles that went well past what the curriculum covered. Tell me about that, Nate said, sitting across from him without preamble. Lee looked up. He was used to Nate by now. The Gryffindor network meant everyone in the house had calibrated to the fact that Nate was unusual, and Lee had gotten there faster than most. Broadcasting theory, Lee said. Enchanted wireless. The ministry controls the broadcast spectrum but the theory has gaps. What kind of gaps? Nate said. Lee's eyes lit. There are frequencies that the ministry monitoring equipment doesn't cover because the equipment was built in the 40s and the frequency theory has expanded significantly since. He stopped. You already know about this. I've been thinking about it from a different angle, Nate said. Tell me yours. They talked for 2 hours. What came out of it was, in outline, the beginning of what would eventually become Potterwatch, though neither of them called it that yet, and the full form of it would take months. But the skeleton was there, an independent information channel, operating outside ministry oversight, using the regulatory gaps in the broadcast spectrum that Lee had identified and the security enchantments Nate had been developing. A way to get truthful information to a wizarding public that was being systematically misinformed. He brought Hermione in on it the next day. She sat with the information for 30 seconds before she started talking, and what she said in the first 30 seconds was specific and useful and 3 steps ahead of where he'd been. She'd been thinking about the propaganda problem since September and had a framework for it that was more sophisticated than his in areas where sociology overlapped with institutional behavior. He incorporated it completely without ceremony, and she noticed that he incorporated it completely without ceremony and said, "You're not going to argue with any of it?" "You're right about all of it," he said. "I might have missed something." "Tell me what you might have missed," he said. "We'll check." She pressed her lips together against a smile that was becoming less guarded by the month. "You're irritatingly reasonable," she said. "I'm optimized," he said. "There's a distinction." She laughed, a real one, surprised. He'd noticed that he could surprise Hermione Granger into laughing, which was one of his favorite things about the year. Fleur came back to the castle in December. She was there on a professional basis, the early stages of a placement at Gringotts that had her in Britain through the winter, and Hogwarts had an informal arrangement with former Triwizard champions that allowed them certain access privileges. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and found him in the library, which she did with the directness of someone who had located him specifically, not wandered in accidentally. She sat down across from him and looked at him with those blue eyes and the composed expression that he could now read all the way through. Under the composure was something warm and slightly complicated, the expression of someone who has spent 6 months away from a person and thinking about them and is now back in their actual presence, recalibrating expectations against reality. "You look the same," she said. "So do you," he said. "How's France?" "France is France," she said. "Gringotts is interesting." She paused. "I've been reading about what's happening here. The ministry situation," he said. "And the woman they have teaching defense," she said, with a precision that left no room for ambiguity about her feelings on Umbridge. She put her hands on students. "Yes," he said. "And Dumbledore aloud, Dumbledore is managing a political situation that limits his direct intervention options," he said. "I don't love it either. We're working around it." She looked at him steadily. "You are building something," she said. "Several things," he said. "The defense group. The information network." She tilted her head. "What else?" "You've been paying attention," he said. "I pay attention to things that matter to me," she said, and the sentence was direct and deliberate, and she met his eyes while she said it with the specific courage of someone choosing not to look away from what they mean. He held her gaze. "How long are you in Britain?" "Through April," she said. "At minimum." "Then you'll be around for what comes next," he said. "What comes next?" "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "But it's building. I can feel it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to help." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm going to let you." She looked at him with an expression that was bright and slightly exasperated and warm all at once, the expression he'd been filing and thinking about and finding increasingly difficult to file away neatly. "You are the most infuriating person I have ever met," she said. "You've told me that before," he said. "It keeps being true," she said. "Good," he said. "Infuriating means you're paying attention. I want you paying attention." She stared at him. Then she leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has decided something about a situation but isn't ready to say it yet. "Tell me about the information network," she said. He told her. She contributed 3 things in the first hour that were significantly better than his existing approach, because her access to Gringotts and the adult professional world of British magical society gave her a perspective on information distribution that he and Lee didn't have. He incorporated all 3 without hesitation. She watched him do it with the particular expression she got when something surprised her. "You do that with everyone," she said. "When someone has something better, she made a gesture. Use it. Without making it a thing." "Why would I make it a thing?" he said. "Most people's pride in being right is less useful than being right," he said. "I'd rather have the better answer than be the person who found it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "Nate." "Yes. I am going to say something and I want you to not be diplomatic about it." "I'm rarely diplomatic," he said. "No," she said. "You're direct, which is different." She took a breath. "What is happening between us? What has been happening since last year? I need you to tell me what it is." He set down his quill. He looked at her, really looked, the full attention that people found disconcerting and that Fleur had learned to hold, months ago, without looking away. "You know what it is," he said. "I want to hear you say it." "It's real," he said. "It's been real since the lake. Before that, even, but the lake was when I was sure." She held his gaze. Something in her face shifted, the last thing coming down, the final layer of the armor, not gone but set aside, put somewhere accessible rather than deployed. "And the others," she said. "Hermione. Daphne. Also real," he said. "Different, but real." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her process it, not with discomfort, not with the possessive contraction he'd seen in people who couldn't conceive of something operating outside their assumed framework. Fleur Delacour had grown up being too much for the world around her. She understood, better than most, that some people didn't fit into the boxes that were prepared for them. "They know," she said. "They know about each other," he said. "They haven't fully said the thing yet. None of you have, in as many words." He paused. "Neither have I." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. She uncrossed her arms. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and looked at him with those blue eyes that were nothing like their public surface, not the Vila beauty, not the champion's composure, just Fleur, direct and bright and real. "Then say it," she said. "In as many words." He looked at her. "I want you in my life," he said. "Not as a category. As Fleur. The way you actually are, the whole of it, the pride and the laugh and the way you think and the way you're brave about things that other people are cowardly about. All of it." She was quiet. Outside the library window, December had arrived and the sky was the gray of something about to snow. Inside, the library was warm and specific and Fleur was looking at him with an expression that he was adding to his mental collection of expressions that were going to matter for the rest of this life. "All of it," she said. "That is a lot to ask for." "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She smiled. "The real one, the unguarded, bright one." She said. Dackard. February. The Department of Mysteries crisis arrived the way everything arrived in a year that had been building toward crisis since September, fast, at night, through a connection that bypassed all the careful preparation with the simple blunt instrument of Harry's mind. Harry's vision. Serious. The Department of Mysteries. He knew, before anyone confirmed anything, that it was a trap. He knew it the way he knew all the patterns he'd been cataloging. Voldemort was inside Harry's connection, he'd been watching for the signs for months, and this had the specific signature of something designed to use Harry's loyalty as the mechanism. The thing most likely to make Harry act without thinking was the person he'd go furthest to protect. He told Harry this while Harry was still shaking from the vision. Harry looked at him with eyes that were half his and half something else and said, "What if it's real?" "It might be real," Nate said. "Doesn't change the analysis. If Sirius is, if Sirius is in danger, we go get him, Nate said. And we go prepared for a trap, which means we don't go stupid. He paused. We contact Snape. We contact the Order. Snape won't, Snape will, Nate said, with the flat certainty of someone who had spent a year reading Severus Snape at close range and had arrived at a conclusion that differed from the common one. He's not what he looks like from the outside. I'll deal with Snape. He dealt with Snape by walking into the man's office and saying, plainly, Harry's had a vision of Sirius Black in the Department of Mysteries. It may be fabricated by Voldemort to lure Harry there. The Order needs to know. Snape looked at him across the office with those dark, layered eyes. The hostility that lived permanently in his expression when looking at Gryffindors was present, but underneath it something else was present too, the specific alertness of someone for whom this information was significant. How, Snape said, carefully, do you know about the Order? Same way I know most things, Nate said. Careful observation and basic inference. Professor, we don't have time for this. Contact them. Snape looked at him for 3 seconds. 3 long, calculating seconds. Then he turned to his fireplace. He turned to his fireplace, and Nate let out a breath he hadn't been fully holding. They went anyway. Of course they went, there was no scenario where Harry stayed behind, and Nate wasn't going to try to stop him because the Order wasn't going to get there in time, and Sirius's situation, real or fabricated, required a response faster than adult deliberation could provide. He gathered who was available, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville, Luna, and did the fastest threat assessment he'd ever run. Luna was steady. Ginny was better than people realized. Neville was, he looked at Neville, who was standing with his wand out and his jaw set, and thought, yes, actually. Stay close, he told them. Stay together. If we get separated, find each other. If something goes wrong, you'll have sorted it already, Ron said, with the flat confidence of someone who had been watching Nate sort things for 4 years. Probably, he said. But just in case. The Department of Mysteries was dark and strange and built around the specific logic of a place that studied things that defied ordinary logic: time, space, death, love. He moved through it with his senses at their fullest extension, monitoring magic in the walls, on the floors, in the air. He was running 4 clones simultaneously in the space, a technique he'd never tested in an active environment, and which worked with the specific efficiency of something that had been drilled in theory long enough to transfer into practice without fumbling. The prophecy. The Death Eaters. Bellatrix. The fight in the Department of Mysteries was the most genuinely dangerous engagement he'd been in during this life, and he entered it with the clear-eyed recognition that danger required not less precision but more. He moved through it with the specific quality of someone for whom combat was a vocabulary he'd been speaking fluently for decades, anticipating, positioning, protecting the people behind him while maintaining his own offensive capacity. He covered Hermione when the purple flame caught her, taking the edge of it on his left arm, feeling the burn of it but staying upright, pushing her behind him and sending the caster backward with a blast of force that had nothing tender in it. He got Neville through the rotating room when Neville's nose was broken and the pain was making everything swim, supporting him one-handed and navigating with the other. He crossed the death chamber in 45 seconds and emerged on the other side with 3 people who had been about to not emerge at all. The Order arrived. The adults arrived, as adults do in these situations, after the children had survived the worst of it, in time to manage the aftermath. Sirius. He was there. He was alive. He fought with the wild, uncalculated joy of a man who had been caged too long, and then, the veil. Bellatrix's spell. The wrong angle. Sirius going backward with the surprised expression of someone who has not expected this specific moment, and then the veil, and then the nothing beyond it that was the specific terrible nothing of a door that only opened in one direction. He heard Harry make a sound that wasn't a word. He got to Harry in 3 strides and put both hands on his shoulders, not restraining, grounding, and Harry's legs didn't go out but they threatened to, and he held him there in the archway room with the veil moving gently in air that had no reason to be moving, and felt the specific weight of a grief he recognized from his first life. Some things couldn't be fixed. Some losses were simply losses. He'd learned that truth in Konoha, and it hadn't gotten easier with repetition, but it had gotten simpler, not smaller, but clearer, the specific clarity of understanding that some things hurt because they were real and the realness was worth it. "I've got you," he said to Harry. Not "it's okay." Not "he's gone." Just, "I've got you." Present tense. Here. Harry gripped his forearm and held on, and Nate held on back. Voldemort arrived in the atrium above with the specific timing of someone for whom this whole sequence had been constructed, and found Dumbledore already there, and the fight between them was, he heard it more than saw it, managing the group below, the collision of two extraordinary forces with nothing between them but intent and will and the specific quality of power that comes from having lived entirely for something. Harry went up. Nate followed with 3 seconds between them, arriving at the tail end of the atrium battle, in time to see Voldemort's red eyes on Harry and the beginning of something that was going to use the connection between them, and Fudge arriving with Ministry Aurors, and the whole terrible machinery of it lurching into a new configuration. Voldemort left. He always left when the math went against him. That was one of his characteristics, the absolute animal self-preservation that sat under everything he built, the thing that had kept him alive in every form and would keep him running now. Fudge stood in the atrium of the Ministry of Magic in February and looked at the evidence of everything he'd been denying for a year. He looked at it for a long moment. His face went through something complicated. Then he looked at Harry. He didn't speak. He couldn't, apparently, find the shape of what to say when the shape of everything had just changed. Nate stepped forward. He'd been in the background, he was often in the background, by choice, when Harry needed to be the front, but he stepped forward now and looked at Fudge with complete calm. "The Wisengamot will need a statement," he said. "I'd suggest sooner rather than later. Every hour of delay makes the recovery harder." Fudge looked at him. You're a student." "I'm the person who just helped prevent a much worse outcome in your ministry building," Nate said, without particular heat. "The student part is a technicality." One of the Aurors nearby made a sound that might have been agreement. Fudge looked at him for a moment longer. Then he looked at Harry. Then he looked at the state of his atrium and the evidence that had just obliterated a year of deliberate official denial. "Right," Fudge said, in the voice of a man whose world had just reorganized itself around him without his permission. "Right." The school year ended in the specific way of years that had remade things, loudly at the surface and very quietly underneath. Umbridge was gone, removed in circumstances that Nate was certain involved centaurs and was equally certain he didn't need to investigate further. Sirius was gone in a way that was permanent and that Harry was carrying with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided to carry something rather than put it down. Dumbledore was back in his office and the dynamic between him and Harry had changed, was continuing to change, in the direction of something more honest. On the train home, the four of them found a compartment. He, Hermione, Daphne, who had technically never been in his compartment before and sat down with the ease of someone for whom the decision had been made weeks ago, and Fleur, who was traveling to London and had found them on the platform with the directness that was her primary mode of navigation. 4 people in one compartment. He looked at all of them, in the specific late afternoon light of a June train moving south, and felt something settle in him that had been moving for a long time. Hermione was reading, but watching him over the top of the page. Daphne was doing what Daphne did, looking out the window, composed, but she'd put her foot against his on the floor in the specific deliberate way she had of being physical when she'd decided to be, and it was staying there. Fleur was speaking quietly in French with herself, the thing she did when she was thinking, and her hand was on the seat between them, close enough to be deliberate. "Next year," Hermione said, not putting her book down. "What do we do?" "Everything," he said. She looked at him properly, over the page. "That's not a plan." "It's the beginning of one," he said. Daphne turned from the window. "The political landscape is going to shift fast now that the ministry can't deny it. Fast is an understatement, he said. Voldemort's going to move, Fleur said, in English now, direct. Yes, he said. Which means we move first. All three of them were looking at him. 3 faces, 3 different kinds of attention, 3 women who had each in their own way looked at him clearly and chosen to stay in his vicinity not because he'd asked them to and not because he had something they needed, but because they'd each, in their own time, decided he was someone they wanted to face whatever was coming alongside. The train moved south. England went gold in the early evening light. He looked at all 3 of them and thought, this is the life I came back for. Not for battle. Not for victory. Not for the specific thrill of being capable in a world that needed capable people. For this specific compartment, these specific faces, the particular and irreplaceable warmth of being known by people who chose to know you. He'd saved a world once. He was going to help save this one too. But this time he was doing it with people beside him every step of the way. The future was loud and coming fast. He was ready. Chapter 6, A World Worth Living in 6th year started with war already in the air. Not the invisible, deniable tension of 5th year, this was different, heavier, the specific weight of a thing that had moved from threat to fact. Voldemort's return was acknowledged now, officially, by a ministry that had spent a year burning its credibility denying it and was now spending whatever was left trying to look like it had always been prepared. Death Eater activity had tripled over the summer. 3 families gone. 2 Muggle villages. A bridge in the West Country that collapsed in the specific way that only happened when structural magic was involved and the perpetrators didn't care about subtlety anymore. He read all of it on the train north in September. The same seat, the same window, England going from summer into early autumn green. Different papers this time, The Prophet, yes, but also independent publications that Lee and his growing network of correspondents had been building towards since 5th year, and which had quietly become the more reliable source for people who'd stopped trusting the ministry's preferred narrative. He'd spent the summer productively. Daphne's father had come to meet him in July. He'd expected it eventually. Daphne had mentioned the request he'd made on the train in September of 5th year, and Cyrus Greengrass was not the kind of man who moved on anyone else's timeline, so the 7-month delay before he showed up at Marin's cottage on a Tuesday afternoon was not hesitation, it was assessment. He'd been deciding whether Nate was worth his time. He came in, sat down, accepted tea from Marin with the manners of someone raised in a house where courtesy was non-negotiable, looked around the small Welsh cottage with eyes that were the same grey as his daughter's and told you the same things, clear, not cold, currently cataloguing everything they touched, and said, "My daughter tells me you are someone worth knowing." "I'm told that occasionally," Nate said. "She doesn't say it about people lightly." "I know," Nate said. "It was one of the things that made me pay attention to her." Cyrus Greengrass looked at him. He was in his mid-40s, lean, with the specific quality of a man who had spent his life in a world that rewarded ruthlessness and had found ways to succeed in it without becoming ruthless, which was a considerably harder thing to manage than it looked. There were lines around his eyes that were the lines of someone who watched carefully and said little and lived with the weight of the gap between those two things. "Tell me what you see," Cyrus said. "In the current situation." "You want to know if I'm useful," Nate said. "Or if I just seem useful?" "Yes." "Fair question," he said, and told him. He laid out the political landscape with the same systematic clarity he applied to every problem, what was true, what was being obscured, what the next 6 to 12 months would look like based on the trajectory he'd been tracking. He talked about Voldemort's strategic priorities, about the ministry's structural vulnerabilities, about the way the Death Eater social network operated and where its pressure points were, about what a family positioned like the Greengrasses could do to maximize their survival probability while remaining operationally flexible. Cyrus listened. Not the listening of someone waiting for the moment they could respond, genuinely listening, the way Daphne listened, the same quality of attention in both of them that he'd always found more honest than most people's most honest moments. When Nate finished, there was a silence. "You're 16, Cyrus said. 15, technically, Nate said. "My birthday is in October." "That makes it worse," Cyrus said, though his tone said it didn't make it worse at all. The analysis is the analysis, Nate said. My age doesn't change it. Cyrus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, what do you need from me? Access, Nate said. Information. A connection to the parts of the political world I can't reach directly yet. In exchange, you get what you just heard, consistently, from someone who has no stake in telling you what you want to hear. Everyone has a stake, Cyrus said. Mine is Daphne's safety, Nate said. And everyone in her vicinity. Which currently includes your family. So our interests align. Cyrus Greengrass looked at him across the kitchen table of Marin's cottage, with tea going cold between them and the Welsh countryside entirely indifferent outside the window. He looked at him with those grey eyes that had given Daphne her best feature, and whatever he saw made him say, I'm going to regret this, or I'm going to be very glad of it. Probably both, Nate said. Cyrus smiled, brief, genuine, the smile of a man who had been expecting to be managed and found himself respected instead. Both, then, he said. They shook hands. Marin, from the kitchen, made a sound that was not quite a comment and was definitely an opinion. The castle in September had the specific quality of a place where people knew the fun was over. Not despair, people weren't at despair yet, that came later, but the seriousness of a student body that had spent a summer being reminded what the stakes actually were and had come back to school with that knowledge sitting somewhere uncomfortable. Dumbledore had changed. He could see it from the first feast, something in the headmaster's bearing had shifted over the summer, a weight that hadn't been there before, or had been there but was sitting differently now, closer to the surface. The hand was injured, wrapped, clearly painful, the specific coloration of dark curse damage that didn't respond to ordinary treatment. He noted it and filed it. He met with Dumbledore in October. The conversation was different from the one they'd had in 5th year. Less fencing. Less of the chess player assessing the board. Dumbledore sat across from him in the warmly lit office and looked at him with eyes that had moved past the phase of wondering what Nate was and into the phase of wondering what to do with what he knew. The Horcruxes, Nate said. Dumbledore was very still. Fawkes made no sound. You found at least 2, Nate said. Possibly 3. The ring was one, that's where the hand came from. The diary from 2nd year was another, which means Harry destroyed one without knowing what it was. He paused. How many? The silence in the office had the quality of something very large very carefully contained. Then Dumbledore said, 7. Total or remaining? Total, by Voldemort's design. 2 confirmed destroyed. We are searching for the rest. We, Nate said. Harry and I, Dumbledore said. Though I will note, with the full candor you requested last year, that my plan has always had a component I have not shared with Harry. That I have not shared with anyone. Nate looked at him. Tell me. Dumbledore looked at his damaged hand. He looked at Fawkes. He looked at the desk, and the pensieve, and the portraits of previous headmasters who were doing an excellent job of appearing to be asleep. Then he looked at Nate with the expression of a man who has carried something alone for a very long time and has arrived at the moment of putting it down. He told him. By the end of it Nate was on his feet, which he hadn't planned, standing by the window looking at the dark grounds below with his hands braced on the windowsill because he needed something solid under his hands while his mind processed what he'd just been told. Harry was a Horcrux. The 7th, unintended, made the night Voldemort's killing curse rebounded in Godric's Hollow and split his soul one final time. Harry Potter had been carrying a fragment of Tom Riddle's soul since he was 1 year old, and Dumbledore had known it, and the plan, the long, careful, heartbreaking plan, was that Harry would need to die. He stood at the window. He processed it. He took it apart and put it back together 3 times from different angles, the way he did when a conclusion was so significant that he needed to be certain he hadn't made an error somewhere. He hadn't made an error. No, he said. The magic, no, he said again, and turned from the window. His voice was not raised. It was not angry in any demonstrative sense. It was the specific register of someone who has made a decision and is not entertaining alternative framings of it. There is always another way. Always. If you haven't found it, it means you haven't looked hard enough or long enough or from the right angle. Nate, he's 17 years old, Nate said. He is my friend. He has been through more than anyone in this school, more than most adults in this world, and I am not going to sit here and accept a plan whose conclusion is that he needs to die. The soul fragment has to be destroyed, Nate said. I agree. I'm not arguing about that. I'm arguing about the assumption that the only way to destroy it is to destroy the container. He moved back to the chair, sat down, put both hands flat on the desk. Give me the pensive memories. Everything you have on Horcrux theory. Everything on how they're made, how they're destroyed, what the mechanism of destruction actually is at the magical level. Dumbledore looked at him across the desk. Even if there were another way, there is another way, Nate said. I don't know what it is yet. I'm going to find it. He held the old man's gaze. You built your plan around the information you had. Give me the information. Let me see what you missed. Dumbledore was quiet for a very long time. The office breathed around them, portraits, instruments, fire. What makes you so certain, he said finally, that you can find something I have not? Because you've been looking for a path that keeps the world safe at the cost of Harry, Nate said. I'm looking for a path that keeps both. Different question gets different answers. He paused. You're the greatest wizard alive. You also care about Harry, and sometimes the thing you care about most is the thing you can't see clearly. Dumbledore looked at him. Something happened in the old man's expression that was not simple, not relief, not surrender, not quite hope. Something more complicated, the expression of a man who has held something alone for long enough that the act of sharing it changes its shape. The memories, Dumbledore said. Yes. I'll show you the memories. He didn't sleep for 3 days. He ran 10 clones, his current maximum, built up over months of pushing his capacity, and sent them in rotating shifts at the pensive memories, at the theoretical literature, at the first principles of what soul magic actually was at its deepest level. He worked in the room of requirement with the door locked and the room configured as a research space, walls of notes and connective lines, the specific organized chaos of someone moving very fast through a very large problem. Hermione found him on the second day. He hadn't told her everything, not yet, not until he had something real, but she'd seen the clones working through the library that morning and had followed the trail with the instincts of someone who'd been paying attention to him for 5 years. She looked at the wall of notes. She looked at him. She looked at the clones. Tell me, she said. He told her. Not all of it, not the specific horror of Harry's situation, not yet, because he needed to find the answer first and he could not tell her that and then have nothing to offer, but the framework, the mechanism, the specific question he was trying to answer. She sat down on the floor cross-legged with a quill and a stack of parchment and she started working. She found the thread at 4 in the morning on the 3rd day. He almost missed it because he was running on 6 hours of sleep across 3 days and the clones were doing the heavy lifting, but she caught it and said, Nate, in a specific voice and he was across the room before she finished his name. Forced extraction, she said. Look, the mechanism of Horcrux destruction isn't annihilation of the soul piece. It's, the container is destroyed which destabilizes the fragment, but the fragment itself dissipates. It goes somewhere. It's released. She was pointing at passages, connecting them with her finger on the parchment. If the container is a living person, the fragment is anchored differently, connected to the host's own soul by proximity and time and the specific magical signature of the host's, sacrificial protection, he said. Yes, Lily's magic. It created a secondary anchoring structure. The Horcrux is held by 2 things, not one, Voldemort's original anchoring and the overlay of Lily's protection magic. She looked up. If you could isolate the original anchoring and sever only that, the piece dissipates, he said. Without destroying the container. Theoretically, she said. How theoretically? I don't know. Extremely theoretically. The precision required would be extraordinary, he said. He was already thinking, already mapping the technique he'd been developing for 6 years against the specific requirements of this problem. But not impossible. She looked at him. She looked at the wall of notes. Then she looked at him again with an expression that was doing the specific thing it did when she was afraid and didn't want to perform the fear but couldn't entirely eliminate it. He doesn't know, she said. Not yet. You need to tell him. I know, he said. When I have something real to tell him with. She was quiet. Her hand found his on the floor between them, not dramatic, just present, the specific warmth of someone being physically with you because the alternative was being physically elsewhere and that wasn't acceptable. He turned his hand over and held hers and they sat in the room of requirement at 4 a.m. with the wall of notes around them and the weight of the thing they'd found, and it was one of the truest moments he'd had in this life. He told Harry in November. He requested nothing special, just the two of them, late evening in the empty common room, the fire going, the castle quiet above them. He told Harry everything. The Horcruxes. The Count. The plan Dumbledore had been running. What that plan concluded Harry needed to do. And then he told him what he and Hermione had found. Harry listened to all of it without speaking. He sat across from Nate in the firelight with his green eyes steady and his hands flat on his knees and his face doing something complicated and very controlled, the specific control of someone who has long practice with receiving devastating information and has learned to hear it before he feels it. When Nate finished, there was a silence. He was going to let me walk into it, Harry said. Quiet. Not accusing, processing. He was going to tell you when he thought the time was right, Nate said. I think he was afraid the knowing would change how you moved through the year. He was right about that, Harry said. Yes, Nate said. But it was still your information. Your life. Your choice. Harry looked at the fire. And your thing. The extraction. Extremely theoretical at present, Nate said honestly. I know the mechanism. I don't know if I can execute it. I've been practicing the technique for 6 years, the precise internal energy manipulation that would be required. But I've never done anything at this scale. What's your honest assessment? Harry said. 60%, Nate said. Maybe 70 if I have more time to refine it. And if it doesn't work? Then we're back to Dumbledore's version, Nate said. Which I will not let happen without exhausting every other option first. Harry looked at him. In 5 years of knowing each other, they'd had 100 conversations that mattered, but this one was different from all of them, not because of the stakes, though the stakes were as high as they got, but because of the quality of what was between them. Not hero and support. Not the strong one and the one being protected. Two people who had looked at a terrible thing together and decided to face it without pretending it was something else. Okay, Harry said. Okay. I trust you, Harry said simply. I have for 5 years. That doesn't change because the thing is bigger. He paused. But I need you to promise me something. Name it. If it comes to it, Harry said, and your thing doesn't work, don't let me die trying to avoid it. Don't, he stopped. Start it again. I'm not afraid of it. I need you to know that. If it has to happen, it has to happen, and I'd rather it happen clearly than sideways because someone's trying to protect me. Nate looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what he knew of sacrifice, from both his lives, what it meant, what it cost, what it bought. He thought about Niji, and about Jiraiya, and about Sirius, and about every person who had stepped into the space between someone they loved and something terrible. I hear you, he said. And I'm telling you it's not going to come to that. Harry held his gaze. You can't know that. No, Nate said. But I can work toward it like I do. Harry was quiet. Then, with the specific lightness of someone choosing it deliberately because the alternative is unbearable, 60 to 70%. That's honestly not bad for extremely theoretical. I've had worse odds, Nate said. When? He smiled. Different life. Spring arrived fast, the way springs do in years that are moving too quickly. He pushed the extraction technique to its absolute limit, running clones through theoretical iterations while he practiced the physical form of it on increasingly complex magical constructs he'd built in the room of requirement. He was doing things with wandless energy manipulation that had no name in the established literature. He'd checked, thoroughly, twice, and the precision required was at the edge of what his current capacity could sustain. He was also, simultaneously, fighting a war on every other front. The Horcrux hunt was happening on two tracks, Dumbledore's track with Harry, which was progressing, and a secondary track that he'd been running through Cyrus Greengrass's information network, which had led him to the location of the locket before the Gaunt Shack visit and had saved Dumbledore a significant amount of time and one near-fatal dark curse encounter. The old man had received the intelligence through an intermediary, and Nate had watched from a careful distance as Dumbledore's face, when he realized the source, did something complicated and grateful. The Potterwatch network was broadcasting 3 times weekly by February. Lee's operation had expanded to include 8 contributors and had developed an audience that the ministry couldn't quantify because they couldn't monitor it effectively. It was, in small, practical terms, one of the most useful things he'd built, the specific resistance of accurate information in a propaganda environment, the thing that kept people oriented when official sources were working to disorient them. Fleur was in and out of his life with the rhythms of someone working and living in Britain but not tethered to a school schedule. She came to the castle on weekends when she could, and when she was there she was fully there, not Gringotts colleague or Triwizard champion, just Fleur, bright and direct and occasionally infuriating in the best possible way. She'd met Daphne properly for the first time in October, in a meeting that had the potential to be territorial and wasn't, because both of them were too smart and too real for territory. They'd circled each other for about 20 minutes and then found a subject they both cared about, the intersection of French and British potion traditions, of all things, and had been talking genuinely ever since. He'd watched that conversation happen from across the room with the specific feeling of something aligning that had been tilted for a long time. Daphne had said to him afterward, with characteristic precision, "She's good." "Yes," he said. "She's very direct." "You're very direct," he said. "I'm controlled," she said. "She's direct. It's different." She paused. "I like it." He smiled. "I know." She gave him a look that said she was aware he was pleased with himself and had opinions about that. Then she said, "Hermione is also good," in the tone of someone completing an inventory. "Yes," he said. "You're going to be insufferable about this," she said. "I'm really not," he said. "I'm just happy," she said. Flatly. Like it was obvious. He looked at her. She looked back with those clear gray eyes that were open now in a way they almost never had been when he first met her, the armor still present but habitual rather than necessary, something she wore by preference and could take off. "Yes," he said. "I am." She looked at him for a moment that had warmth in it, not performed warmth, not the careful calibrated version she'd deployed for years, genuine warmth, the specific kind that lives in the chest and moves through the face without being invited. "Good," she said, and went back to her work. May. The year collapsing toward its end, and Dumbledore was dying. He'd known it since winter, the curse from the ring was beyond what any treatment could permanently arrest, and the headmaster had known it too, and had been moving with the specific deliberateness of someone working against a deadline they could see. He sat with Dumbledore in April, the last real conversation they had where the old man was fully present and not yet managing his own diminishment. "I want to tell you something," Dumbledore said. "Tell me," Nate said. "I have made many plans in my life," Dumbledore said. "Many of them have been good. Some of them have been, not bad, exactly. But they have treated people as means rather than ends. As pieces rather than persons." He looked at his damaged hand. "I did that with Harry. I intended to do it with you, at the beginning, before it became clear that you were not amenable to being placed. I noticed, Nate said. I imagine you did. The blue eyes were very clear. I want to tell you that I am grateful. Not for what you've accomplished, though you have accomplished extraordinary things. For the way you've accomplished them. You have done everything I did, but you have not left people behind in the doing of it. Nate was quiet. That is harder than it sounds, Dumbledore said. I know because I found it impossible, and I was trying. You weren't trying hard enough, Nate said, without heat. But you weren't wrong about everything either. Dumbledore smiled, genuine, tired, warm. No, he said. Not everything. They sat together for a while in the warmth of the office, with Fawkes doing the specific low sound he made when something in the room needed comforting and the fire going orange and the castle moving quietly around them. The extraction, Dumbledore said. You're ready. Almost, Nate said. Almost is not, I know, he said. I'll be ready. Dumbledore looked at him steadily. I believe you, he said. And the weight of that, the weight of Albus Dumbledore, who had doubted almost everything for the last 40 years of fighting, saying I believe you, landed somewhere real. Dumbledore died on a Tuesday in June. The Tower. Snape, who had done what Dumbledore had arranged for him to do, at Dumbledore's request, as the final sacrifice of a man whose plans ran all the way to the last possible moment. He stood at the funeral with Harry on his left and Hermione on his right, and across the gathering, Daphne was with her family, and she found his eyes once over the crowd with that clear grey gaze, and he held it, and it was enough. The final year, not 7th year at Hogwarts, which had become something else entirely under Death Eater administration, unfolded the way endings unfold in war, fast and terrible and occasionally luminous in the specific way that extreme circumstances are sometimes luminous, moments of absolute clarity in the middle of destruction. He was not at Hogwarts for most of it. He was in the network, moving, coordinating, running the information channels and the safe house connections and the lines of support for people who needed extraction from situations that had become untenable. He ran 12 clones continuously for 3 months, the sustained maximum of what this body could manage, and the information those 12 simultaneous versions of him generated and processed kept people alive in ways that would never appear in any official account of the war. He found the remaining Horcruxes in parallel with Harry's search, coming at them from the information network's angle while Harry came from Dumbledore's prepared path. They coordinated through a communication system he'd built in 5th year, messages that were untraceable through a mechanism that borrowed from both chakra suppression theory and the frequency gaps in the Ministry broadcast spectrum. They passed information back and forth in the real-time language of people who trusted each other completely and had no energy left for anything but the essential. He got the diadem. He and Neville, in a 6-minute operation in Hogwarts's come-and-go room during a stretch of the castle's Death Eater occupation when the wards had a gap he'd been monitoring for 3 weeks. Neville moved with a competence that would have been unrecognizable to the boy who couldn't time an Expelliarmus in 5th year, and Nate thought as he watched him, this is what people look like when someone believes in them properly. He got the cup from Gringotts ahead of Harry's visit, which meant Harry's visit was considerably less life-threatening and the dragon they rode out on was not, in fact, necessary. He sent the information through their channel with a note that said simply, already done, don't risk the bank. Harry's response, 3 minutes later, was, how? Nate's response was, carefully. The Battle of Hogwarts. He was inside the castle when it started. He'd been there for 2 days, working with the resistance that had built up under Neville's leadership in the worst months of the occupation, helping fortify positions and coordinate evacuation routes and do the 1,000 small logistical things that determined whether large battles resulted in unnecessary deaths. When Voldemort's voice rolled over the castle from outside and the Death Eaters started coming through the gates, he was already where he needed to be. He fought with everything he had. All of it, visible, unrestrained, every technique from both his lives that had application in this world, 12 clones working simultaneously across the castle's most contested positions, wandless and wand magic deployed with the specific economy of someone for whom these were not dramatic last resorts but trained responses. He was everywhere and nowhere, moving with a speed that people who saw it described afterward as not quite explicable, present in the Great Hall when the giants came through the outer wall, present at the covered bridge when the Death Eaters tried to flank, present at the 7th floor corridor where Bellatrix was doing something that he was not going to let Bellatrix do. He didn't kill. In all of it, across all the hours of the battle, he didn't kill anyone. Not because he couldn't, he could, easily, more cleanly and quickly than anyone else on the field, but because killing had a cost that he'd counted in his first life and understood well enough to avoid in his second when avoidance was possible. He incapacitated. He redirected. He stood between things that wanted to harm the people he cared about, and he was what he was, which was enough. He found Daphne on the 6th floor at 2 in the morning, a 3-on-1 situation that she was handling better than could be reasonably expected, but that was going wrong at the margins. He came through the intersection at a dead run, 3 clones fanning from him like extensions of intent, and the 3 Death Eaters were down in 11 seconds, bound, disarmed, unconscious, and the corridor was quiet. Daphne had a cut above her eyebrow that was bleeding freely and her composure was entirely intact, and she looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "Took you long enough." "I was elsewhere," he said, pulling her aside to check the cut, "not serious, surface, pressure and a healing spell," and she let him with the ease of someone who had long since decided that certain touches from this specific person were acceptable and had built that decision into her permanent operating parameters. "Astoria is in the evacuation group," she said. "The 3rd years and below." "I know," he said. "They're out. I checked." She held his gaze. "Of course you did," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude and was the specific thing that lives between them, warmer and more durable. He put his hand against her face briefly. She leaned into it for exactly 1 second. Then she straightened and said, "Where do you need me?" "East Corridor," he said. "Lupin's team is stretched." She went. He went the other direction. The hour of Harry's death that wasn't. He knew what Harry was going to do. They'd talked about it, in the months before, in the careful conversations of people planning for every contingency, including the ones they didn't want to plan for. Harry was going to the forest. He'd made his peace with it, the specific peace of someone who has found something worth walking toward regardless of what's on the other side. And Nate had told him, "Trust me." Harry had said, "I always do." He was in the forest too. Not with Harry. Harry needed to be alone for the Horcrux to properly surface, needed the specific quality of willing surrender that would bring it forward. But he was positioned at 40 meters, outside Harry's peripheral awareness, in the shadow of a stand of old oaks with his energy completely suppressed in a way that made him functionally invisible to magical detection. He watched. He breathed. He held the extraction technique in his hands like something he'd been carrying for a very long time and had gotten very strong carrying. Voldemort killed Harry. The curse hit and Harry dropped and the Horcrux screamed. He could feel it, the soul fragment tearing loose from its anchor, the shriek of dark magic being severed from its host. In the second between the curse landing and the liminal state Harry occupied, the thing between, the space Dumbledore had predicted and Nate had planned for, he moved. 40 meters in 3 seconds. Hands on Harry's chest. The extraction technique engaged at full capacity, all 12 clones slamming their combined energy back into him in one simultaneous dispersal that hit like a wave breaking and gave him, for approximately 30 seconds, more raw capacity than he'd ever had in this body. He found the fragment. The torn, shrieking remnant of Tom Riddle's soul, hanging loose in Harry's chest cavity in the specific magical space between the killing curse and whatever came next, anchored to nothing now, Voldemort's original tether gone and Lily's overlay gone with it. He took it. He pulled it, not destroying it, because you couldn't destroy a soul, you could only redirect it, pushed it out and away and up, into the air, into the forest, into the specific quality of dispersal that meant it went nowhere and everywhere, diffused into the ambient magical field of the world like smoke into wind, the last piece of Tom Riddle's fractured soul finally, mercifully, released from whatever it had been trying to hold on to. Harry gasped. He opened his eyes in the forest, in the dark, and he was alive, completely, properly, extraordinarily alive, and Nate had his hands on his chest and was looking at him with an expression that he probably wasn't managing very well. "Hey," Harry said, in a voice that sounded like someone surfacing from very deep water. "Hey," Nate said. His hands were shaking, he noticed. He noted it clinically and decided it was fine. "Did it?" "Yes," Nate said. Harry looked at him. Then he laughed, a rough, short, completely genuine sound. "I knew you'd figure it out," he said. 72% in the end, Nate said. "You said 60 to 70. "I got better," he said. Harry grabbed his arm, the same grip as the Department of Mysteries, the grip of someone who has been afraid and is now not and needs something solid. Nate held on. "Okay," Harry said. "Okay. Let's finish it." Voldemort died the way he'd always been going to die, not because the spell was more powerful or the technique was right or because one specific person was stronger. He died because a 17-year-old boy disarmed him in the moment when the Elder Wand refused to kill its master's killer, and all the dark magic in the world couldn't rewrite the specific logic of that particular enchantment. Harry's spell met Voldemort's killing curse, and one of them was built on a lie about what power actually was, and the one built on the lie fell apart. Nate watched it from 20 feet away, standing in the great hall with smoke in the air and morning coming through the high windows. He watched Voldemort fall. He watched the Death Eaters, those who were still on their feet, begin to understand what had just happened in the specific way that people understand things when the thing they've built their entire identity on stops being true. Some of them ran. Some of them simply stopped moving. Bellatrix was already gone, Molly Weasley had done something spectacular and Nate had been close enough to see it and had made a note to tell Mrs. Weasley, when the moment was right, that she was significantly more formidable than the wizarding world had given her credit for. Silence moved through the great hall like a tide. Then sound, not a battle sound, something different. The sound a crowd makes when something terrible has ended. He stood in it. He let it be what it was. Later. Hours later, when the immediate chaos had moved into the slower grief of aftermath, counting who was there and who wasn't, the specific terrible arithmetic of a battlefield after. He sat on the steps outside the castle in the early morning, the grounds grey and scarred, the sky coming up clean and indifferent the way skies did. Hermione found him first. She came out the main doors and sat beside him without asking, close enough that their shoulders touched. Her face was exhausted and her hair was destroyed and she had ash on her cheek that she hadn't noticed. She looked at the grounds with the expression of someone who had run for so long that the stopping felt like falling. "Is it over?" she said. "This part," he said. She nodded. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat in the early morning light and let the silence be sufficient. Daphne came next. She came out alone, her robes clean despite everything. He had no idea how she'd managed it and suspected it was sheer stubbornness, and she looked at the two of them and then at the grounds and then at the sky, and she sat on his other side and didn't say anything, because she almost never said things she didn't have the exact right words for. He put his other arm around her. She permitted it with the specific quality of permission she gave for physical things, deliberate, complete, not performance. She put her head against his shoulder the same way Hermione had, and on either side of him were two people who had known him as well as he'd ever been known in either of his lives. Fleur came down the steps 10 minutes later. She was walking with her sister, Gabrielle, who had come with the Delacour family as soon as the battle started, and whom Nate had moved to the evacuation point 40 minutes into the fighting without her noticing he'd done it. Fleur saw them and she didn't stop moving. She came across the steps and she kissed him once, directly, in the specific way she did things she'd decided on, and then she sat on the step below him and leaned back against his knee and pulled Gabrielle down beside her. "Say Feeny," she said quietly. Softly, to no one particularly. More to herself. "Say Feeny," he agreed. Gabrielle looked at the group of them and then up at him with those young, bright eyes. "Are you the one Fleur talks about?" she said. "Probably," he said. "She says you are impossible," Gabrielle said. "Also probably true," he said. "Fleur, Without turning around, said, Gabrielle. What? You do say it. I say a great many things. Hermione, against his shoulder, made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh. Daphne's shoulders moved slightly in the specific way that meant she was doing the same and had decided not to show it. He felt it though. He always felt it. Harry appeared at the top of the steps. He looked, exhausted, and shaken, and very alive, which was the most important of the three. He looked down at the assembled group with an expression that went through several things before it settled on something that looked a lot like relief and a lot like the specific gratitude of someone who has come through something terrible and found people waiting on the other side. He came down and sat beside Hermione. She freed one arm from Nate's shoulder and put it around Harry without ceremony, the way she'd always managed to be physically present for the things that counted. They sat. All of them, on the steps of a castle that had just survived something that should have broken it. The sky went from gray to the specific gold of early sun, the kind of sky that didn't care about what had happened under it and came up new anyway, with the absolute indifference of something that has been doing this every morning for longer than any of them could count. He sat in the middle of all of it. He felt, not triumph. Not relief, exactly. Something more durable than both, something that didn't have a name in either language he carried. The feeling of a person who has been through enough to understand what actually matters and has found themselves surrounded by it. In his first life he'd died reaching for a world at peace. In this one he'd lived to help build it. He thought about the mirror of Erist. About the hall he hadn't recognized, the three faces, the way they'd looked at something just outside the frame. He thought about how the thing you wanted most looked simple in a mirror and complicated and irreplaceable in real life. He thought, worth it. All of it. Both lives, every loss, every mile of road that had run from a village in the land of fire to a cottage in Wales to a castle in Scotland to these stone steps in the morning light. Every single mile. What happens now? Hermione said, against his shoulder. We rebuild, he said. Better than what was there before. How? She said. Not doubtful, genuinely asking, which was how she asked everything. The same way we did everything else, he said. Together. With more information than the people who did it last time. He looked at the sky. And without putting the same broken pieces back in the same broken places. That's a project, Daphne said. Dry, precise. Exactly, Daphne. It's a good project, Fleur said. It's going to take years, Hermione said. Probably, he said. I have time. Harry said, from Hermione's other side, we all have time now. The morning came in full. Warm, clear, the specific quality of a day that had no idea how much had been paid for it and didn't need to know. The grounds would be repaired. The castle would be rebuilt, it already was, in the way old magical places rebuilt themselves, stone remembering stone, the enchantments reinserting themselves into the fabric of the structure because they'd been there long enough to be part of it. The world would not fix itself. But it would be worked on, carefully, by people who understood the cost of carelessness and the value of what they were protecting. He'd been doing that kind of work since he was old enough to understand what it meant. He was very good at it. He looked at Fleur, who was watching the sky with the open expression she rarely showed anyone. He looked at Daphne, who had turned her face toward the sun with the specific satisfaction of someone who had survived something she prepared for and found the preparation was worth it. He looked at Hermione, who was looking at him with the expression she'd been working toward for 5 years, clear, warm, entirely without the armor she'd spent her childhood assembling. He looked at Harry, who was already thinking about what came next. He could see it, the way Harry's eyes were moving, looking at the grounds and calculating. Good. Let him think. He'd be there for whatever Harry thought of. The sun came up. A world worth living in. Not perfect, he'd never wanted perfect, perfection was static and static things couldn't grow. But worth it. Worth the work. Worth the cost. He'd known that from the beginning, really. From the moment he'd sat up in a Welsh cottage at 3 years old and drawn a spiral on a piece of paper with the certainty of someone who remembered what it meant. He was here. He was present. He was, in both the ordinary and every extraordinary sense, alive. And the day was only just starting.